The meeting of the Education Innovation Policy Committee will resume, so I'll call us back to order. We had a quorum present this morning, so I needn't call for quorum again. And members, we are discussing House File 3178 as amended. Welcome back, Representative Peterson. You have, I know, others who wanted to testify in support. Do you see any of those in the audience?
No, Madam Chair.
There was Kalia Pringles.
I mean, if you are here, please come forward.
And then do we have those with concerns? I think you want to ask a question, right? Yes, please. So let's see. Oops, aren't we recording it? Thank you. Okay, let's have some questions for the author. Excuse me. Did Amos, do you want to come forward at this time? Please do then, yes. Mr. Kuhnquist, welcome, and say your name and begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Scott Gruenhagen with the Association of Metropolitan School Districts. And just so you know, the same bill is up right now across the street in the Senate, so that's where some of the testifiers are. And I know Mr. Heisted, Dr. Heisted is on your list.
He'll come.
And so I think he'll still be here just
Sure.
So Madam Chair, members, we would like to express a few concerns about the bill. We've had a chance to talk briefly with Representative Peterson, and we do certainly appreciate the concerns and issues she is bringing forward. And we definitely agree that we could have a much more transparent, easier to understand reporting mechanisms in place, report cards, whatever we want to call them. We agree that we need to make it very easy for parents and community members to understand what's going on in their schools and just have that information readily accessible and understandable. We do have concerns, though, when we try to narrow it down to a single summative score, if you will, and whether it's an A through F grading system or, in this case, a 5-star system. And especially when that system then is based strictly on assessments on math and reading. We think parents are also very concerned about and want to know what's going on at that school in terms of world language offerings potentially, pre-K offerings. Does the school offer dual credit opportunities, AP, IB, concurrent enrollment? Many parents and students want to know what's going on in terms of music, art, theater in that school. Extracurricular, co-curricular activities are a huge priority for both students and parents. And so we think not including those types of factors in a cumulative score or a summative score really does not then present an accurate picture of that school. So as you maybe know, Madam Chair, I know as you do know, the Education Department, MDE, is working on this very issue. It's part of the ESSA. They're looking at a dashboard approach to really try to come up with some multiple indicators that would help give parents a better picture of schools. And so we have been participating in that process along with a multitude of stakeholders. And so we would ask, I guess, you, Madam Chair and committee members, to continue down that path, and we are more than happy to continue working with Representative Peterson as the bill moves forward. But we would encourage you to look at a broader array of factors to judge our schools. Thank you, Madam Chair and members.
Thank you, Mr. Kuhnquist. Are there questions for the testifier? Representative Ward.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just wanted to see if we could also, I love the options that you're considering or the considerations you're making, but I wondered if that's the extent of it, or are we also including things like the change in the achievement gap, graduation rates, probably that's high on your list, but access to broadband, internet access. There's a lot of issues that I think would be really important criteria for parents to be able to evaluate. Are those considerations you're making as well?
Mr. Kuhnquist.
Yes, Madam Chair and Representative Ward, absolutely. I wasn't attempting to give an entire list of the factors. The ones you listed, certainly, we think are things that should be looked at as well. And I don't want to diminish the importance of math and reading scores that are in the bill, obviously, highly important, but we just think we need to have a broader look. Thank you.
Are there other questions for Mr. Kuhnquist? Representative Kunesh-Podein.
Thank you. Is that on? Yes. How do I hold that? Do I have to hold it down the whole time? It keeps going off.
I don't think you have
It's
to
on?
do anything. We're
All right,
on.
so this, I'm just wanting to address this bill with my teacher hat. And as a testing coordinator, I was at a elementary school for 20 years, and probably for almost 10 of those years, I was the testing coordinator because I ran the computer labs. And as the testing progressed from paper and pencil to computer, it became more and more my responsibility. And it also became quite a burden, not just for me, because it ended up really affecting my program as a technology instructor and as a teacher, and resources and access to the library, and things going on in the library during testing time that where weeks on end my students weren't able to access it. A lot of that has changed now because a lot of schools are one-to-one, where they have their own laptops or their own computers, and they can access that as well. But some of the issues that I have are some of the things I just want to bring up, and I want you to take into consideration. If you've never experienced testing in the schools, not just for a day or for an hour or for a moment, it is an incredibly stressful time for everybody. From the lunch people to the custodians to the administration to the teachers, and especially on the students. And if you want to assess those students, just in math and reading, through one achievement test, I don't think you're getting a true picture of what that student can do and can't do. There are lots of issues that go into this, and one of them is students who have test anxiety and don't test well. If you've ever looked at this test, and I know teachers aren't supposed to look at the questions or the tests, but these are very lengthy tests. I don't know, do you have any idea how many questions there are in this test, like in the reading test? For a third grader?
30. There are 30 questions that I recall.
Okay, 30 questions for a third grader. It's now May. You can start in March. You have until May to finish it up. It's now springtime. Your friends are outside. They're playing. Your teachers have put you through almost like hell and back teaching to the test, making sure that you've got your math skills and your reading skills up. And I'm going to probably go out on a limb and say 85% of these kids are disconnected from this test at this point. They don't want to sit in a hot computer lab for hours on end, and for some kids it is hours on end that they are sitting in front of a computer. And I've seen many kids just sit there and go click, 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 and they're done in less than 5 minutes because they don't care. So I think that there needs to be some changes to the test, as well as using this as a marker of success in a school as well. I guess one of my questions is, how would you figure in, or how would you calculate in parents that opt out of this test? Because you can, and there are plenty of parents that do. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the majority of parents that opt out of of their students taking a test are perhaps some of the higher achieving students, so that's totally going to affect, that's going to skew the results. The opt-out, student stress, and then just the fact that for months on end, it does turn out to be where teachers are just teaching to the test, and that means that they're not getting the social studies that they should have. Their science, the only time that in the elementary is 5th grade, so other kids aren't getting science. So I don't think that this is the best way to score a school, because there's just so many other things that go into assessing this. But I do have a question, if I could get an answer for this one. Under subdivision 3 and 5, the percent of students rated proficient on a statewide reading test, the academic growth, and I'm thinking, why aren't we using more of like their achievement from where they started to the end? But then I'm wondering why part of the scoring takes into consideration the low-income student achievement gap and then the student of color achievement gap.
Representative Peterson.
Why are those two things that have been kind of plucked out and that they're using as a form of the assessment?
Representative Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, those were some of the extra measures that we also included, recognizing that, I mean, I agree with you, one thing, one test, one making everybody the exact same thing. You need to look at more things, and achievement gap and graduation rates was another one of those measures we thought were important.
Representative Kunesh-Podein.
And so low-income students and students of color achievement addresses that?
Representative Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm sorry, I just don't have the bill right in front of me. Oh, there it is. Okay, so
In your, well, subdivision 3 as well as subdivision 5, excuse me.
So, Madam Chair, so these were the items that we thought could also be incorporated into this 1 to 100 rating system, and looking at these different things, because maybe some schools are really doing well with low-income students, maybe to reduce the achievement gap. Maybe they are doing great things for students of color, and we thought that those were also important pieces to incorporate into sort of that bigger picture to help parents figure out which school they think would best suit their students' needs.
Representative.
Thank you. I would disagree. I don't think that those should be in there. I think it gives people misinformation, or might be misleading, or if folks are looking for a certain racial or socioeconomic level of school that they want their students to attend. I think that is definitely an issue of equity, and I don't think that should be in there. So I would strongly suggest that not be a part of it.
Well, members, keep in mind that these 6 items that are listed would be equally weighted factors unique to each school. So, for example, a school may not have a large number of students of color, but may have a number of students from low-income families who may be close to poverty. So why wouldn't we want that factor then to weigh in equally, since we want to measure something? We're not going to be measuring all of these in every school district, as far as I understand, because they're going to be weighted equally based on the uniqueness of the school. So maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but I think that the creators of this bill have tried to put together a number of items that could be applicable to any kind of school. And we have a variety of them across the state.
Thank you,
Representative
Madam Chair.
Kunesh-Podein.
Maybe variables would be like extracurricular activities that are offered, or language classes that are offered, or destination imagination programs, or the chess club, or those sort of things that are factors that build a positive achievement and academic experience. I just don't know that pulling out the low-income student ratio or the student of color achievement gap is one that should be highlighted in this scoring, this whole scoring situation.
Members, keep in mind that the MCA upon which this bill is created is the state and federal accountability that we must adhere to. You may not like it, I may not like it, but it's the law, and we honor the law. Furthermore, the test that's given in language arts reading and the test that's given in math, we call them the MCAs, are measuring the accomplishments of students based on the benchmarks of the standards. And every teacher who teaches language arts or reading has to address those standards because we have K-12 standards. And then that's an indication to the student, to the teacher, to the parent, how that child has done in achieving our standards. Now, we're standards-based again. It's in the law. We honor the law. You may not like it, I may not like it, but we have to honor the law. And so that is why there is an emphasis on the MCAs and why we honor also the MCA test that's given, because that's an indicator. It certainly was to me as a teacher. How well did I do in teaching my students reading and language arts in the course that I was teaching at the high school level when I was a teacher and they were testing? The standards were different then, but they nevertheless were there, and I was giving a test. So, I hope we understand that basic concept of what we have. Representative Mariani.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And actually, I'm glad we're having this debate. We've been having this debate for a number of years.
Decades.
Trying to, well, right. The standards movement really began well over 100 years ago when we shifted from one-room schoolhouse, pure management to districts. This notion of having districts, we then shifted towards state review, and then in the last 30 years, federal, presence. So it's an American debate, absolutely. It seems to me that the big concern that ought to be here is why are legislators making these decisions? It's true that we have an accountability system, and in fact, we have a reporting under the accountability system. We don't need to do a summative star rating system to report what we've already reporting if the purpose is to capture our accountability system saying something about the nature of our schools. So that's one of the issues, do we want to be a state that attempts to tell the same story twice, and how do we make sure that we're actually telling the same story? There's a lot of questions here that we ought to be asking about whether this particular regime, this framework, aligns with the current ESSA expectations. What's missing, what's different, and do we run the risk of actually sending confusing messages to the public by having two ways to tell that story? I think that's an objective question that we ought to, wrap our heads around. But even before we get to that, it seems to me the issue is, why is Representative Carlos Mariani making the decision about what goes into a star rating? And in this place, what that really means ultimately is it's going to be Democrats and Republicans making those decisions, filtering it through our, political ideologies, And so what we really ought to have, if we're going to do this at all, is to have a group of psychometricians, with a broad range of experiences to be the ones that shape something like this. And so perhaps that's my question to you, Representative Peterson, is who are the experts that shape those issues? And Madam Chair, are we going to hear from psychometricians?
Oh, yes, he's here.
Relative to this issue.
Representative Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Mariani. I guess in this case, what we're trying to do is empower parents. And you can throw a whole bunch of papers and a really confusing website and a whole bunch of information. And where are parents? This is about them and helping them determine what's best for their children. That it's pretty simple. We collect all this data, and wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to use it in a meaningful way? This is about, the same thing as we heard earlier. This is about shining a flashlight and not using a hammer. It's not meant to be punitive. It's meant to be enlightening. And we have wonderful, wonderful public schools. we really do. But to say that they're perfect is, I think, not really being honest with ourselves. We can do better. We can empower parents so that they can make the best decision for our students. And quite frankly, the school districts can, potentially use this as a diagnostic tool. This is where we're doing terrific. This is where we could maybe use some improvement, and you can adjust resources accordingly. But really, it is about being open and honest with our parents.
Representative Mariani.
Madam Chair, that's fair enough, Representative Peterson. Actually, you and I probably agree on this broad values. The devil's going to be in the details, quite frankly. I mean, I would posit that you can have a transparent and fair and open sharing of information that doesn't involve a color-coded system or a star system or a number system, which some people would argue is just a reductionist attempt to describe reality. I mean, parents may want to have information, for instance, that suggests to them how best to interact with a school. So we do a reductionist measurement. Does that give us the detail, the level of detail for a parent to do that? I don't know. I suspect not. I want to hear from people who have a thought about this. Earlier this morning, we heard from those amazing Latina parents who were very clear. They're not playing any kind of partisan game. I mean, they came up and talked to me, and they were just as firm with me as they are with anyone else, and they absolutely should be. And what they said is we need information that arms us. They also talked about the school finder tool in Minneapolis, which is not this tool in front of us. And they talked about how that tool is tailored in such a way that provides the level of information, the kind of information that they need to have in order to make decisions about, the worth of their school, how to interact with their school, or whatever. So what I want to avoid here, frankly, is to get us, into each other's corners here about if you're with this, it's because you really care about being transparent. And if you're not, it's because you don't care about being transparent. There's more than one way to do this thing. And so that, I mean, I'm open on this thing. I've had conversations with all sorts of folks. I have generally been very scared, not scared, but fearful, of taking a reductionist instrument, and avoiding that becoming a judgmental instrument. What we want is to engage people, not to turn them off because they see a code or a number or a star, and that's all they see. I'm talking about human behavior, just basic human behavior. You stick something simple like this in front of folks, and pretty soon it's going to be manipulated to tell a story about the good guys and the bad guys. It is why we got rid of the star rating system back in 2008, which, by the way, Governor Pawlenty signed that law at that time.
Well, we were measuring AYP. That wasn't good.
The governor walked away from it, and wisely, he did so wisely. And now here we are back having this conversation. So it's okay. But let's avoid putting each other in a box in terms of, Carlos or Representative Erickson or whatever, you must not really care if you're with or without. There's more than one way to do this, is what I'm suggesting.
So I see this, Representative Peterson, your proposal and the department's proposal. We're obviously, if this goes forward, going to be in a conference committee, and that's where we do some really good work of trying to, bring forth some ideas that are maybe unique to you and those who've helped you create this. And then the department has some ideas, and they're listening to stakeholders, and I think you are too. So at this point, I wanted to know if Kalia Pringles was in the audience. Yes, please come forward because you wanted to testify this morning. And if there's anyone else who wanted to testify, Rashad Turner, are you in the audience?
He's in the other building, Senate building.
You could come right up here.
Oh, yes, please join Representative Peterson in those wonderfully comfortable seats with the microphones.
They are nice.
And welcome to our committee, and say your name for the record, and please give your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Kulia Pringle, and I am a parent, recent educator. I actually just stopped teaching so that I could do full-time parent organizing and parent advocacy. My work as an advocate has allowed me to travel throughout the state of Minnesota and hear stories from parents. And because of that, I'm here to speak on behalf of all of the families that I've heard from and their stories. Families deserve to have the knowledge needed to be the best advocate for their child. Families deserve to have the data that helps them advocate for their child. Families deserve to have the data in one place. Families deserve to understand the data. Families deserve the opportunity to use their data to be informed and have the knowledge that they need to have a chance of succeeding. Madam Chair, I wanted to just address Representative Mariani's concerns. I heard the same concerns in the Senate. Everyone's concerned that the data is going to be used, or parents are just somehow going to say, oh my gosh, this one star means that this school is just the worst school. You guys are not giving parents enough credit. The data is already out there. I can already go and find the low-performing schools. It's already there. What we're saying is it's too much. I give workshops on a weekly basis on how to navigate the Minnesota Department of Education's report card. And I pride myself on being a good educator, of taking something complicated and making it simple. I have a hard time doing that. And I feel like if parents had the knowledge, they were informed, they could be the best advocate for their child. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pringle. Are there any questions for our testifier? Representative Mariani.
Chair, Ms. Pringle, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I've already said I'm open on this issue. I've had lots of discussions. I do have concerns. One of them came up this morning. So maybe you can tell me, does the bill rating system in the bill here, does that tell anything to an EL parent about whether or not their school is an effective EL instructional school?
Ms. Pringle.
Representative Mariani, we are actually glad that you mentioned that, because we'd like to add that. That's something that we agree. We think that the ELL data should be added. We think that the special education data should be added. We feel it should be broken down as however many ways to give us the tools needed to best advocate for our child. It is, for me, just looking at, I know the MCAs aren't the best, and I know it isn't the end all, but if I know that my child is in a school that's not doing well academically, and that my child is a part of that, but my child is also getting suspended. And I also noticed that the curriculum's not multicultural or culturally responsive. I also noticed that the teachers aren't, like, I could put it all together, you know what I mean? Where it's not like, oh, my child, you guys are looking at it from the wrong way. I get the data and I said, my child is the worst child ever. Or I could look at the data and say, well, I could look at the data and say, okay, well, I can see that there are other things in play that may contribute to why this school may be below performing. And with ESSA coming out, I'm excited about giving parents and letting them know about the school improvement part about ESSA, and having them engage and looking at the data and being like, how can we improve our schools? How can we make our schools better? And I don't know, I just feel like you guys should be happy to just say, yes, we're gonna give you tools you need to advocate for your kid. Like, why wouldn't you want to do that? I don't understand.
Representative Mariani.
Ms. Pringle, thank you. I thank you for that. I do think that what you will find around the table here is precisely that. I think the issue is whether or not one particular tool is the best tool and the best approach. But I do think most folks, if not all of us, in fact, share that desire. We had this experiment a few years ago. It didn't work. You know, so that's part of the reason why some of us are a little bit nervous about this. But, you know, hopefully we won't push this thing through so quickly that we're not having a much more deliberative discussion, or rather that we have the deliberate discussion that we should have to make sure that we do produce powerful tools. I thank you for your presence.
Thank you, Representative Mariani. Thank you, Chair.
Ms.
Madam
Pringle.
Chair.
Was there anyone else who wanted to testify? Or did you have a question for Ms. Pringle? Oh, Ms. Pringle stayed. Representative Pryor, I'm sorry, yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And if there are others who would like to testify in support, I would like them to come forward before we hear those with concerns.
Right, so I also, to talk more about that English language learners and also children with special needs there in the classroom. One thing I noticed about this is this only talks about a 4-year graduation rate, which means that if you're an English language learner and when you start in a junior high school, if you need extra years to graduate, you know, on the one hand, the school will give you those extra years, but your cohort group just shows you as not graduating on time. So, schools that have a lot of these English language learners, which in my district I have 3 schools. One school has very many English language learners. Another school doesn't have any at all, or very, very, very few. So parents would look at this assessment and say, oh, there's one school better than the other, based on the graduation rate. And so, as a parent, was that something, and when you hear from parents, is that something they're aware of, and would you want to see that in an instrument like this?
Madam
Ms. Pringle.
Chair. Thank you. Parents are aware. What I would say is that you guys, like I said, you guys are not giving parents enough credit. I do think that adding ELL, and one thing that I've noticed as a parent advocate, like if you speak in plain language, if you clearly say what you just said, parents would understand. If you look at these test scores are not based on, or such and such, these 4-year test scores are, and say it in the language of these parents, they're gonna understand that. It's as simple as that. I don't think it's, like I said, if you just, like with the Minneapolis School Finder, like when I tell parents, when you're looking at the stuff, this is just the starter. This is what you come to the conversation with when you go visit the school and you ask questions. You ask some initial questions. It's not like you're just going in there and it's just like you just let them tell you, what's going on, and you're like, okay. If I'm armed with something, I can say, what about this data? And the school could say, well, this is this. This is why our English language learners are here, because they came in at a 2-year, rate or whatever the case may be. So.
Representative Maquay, did you have a question for Ms. Pringle?
No, it was very similar to Representative Pryor's.
Thank
Well,
you.
actually,
Maquay,
thank you, Madam Chair.
Maquay, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really liked how you said that. It was if we say it in plain language, then parents understand that. And I think you're right. We should give parents a lot of credit. I think my fear when reading the bill as written is that it isn't saying that in plain language. It just says it in a 4-year graduation rate. And so my parents, who, my brother and I were not English language learners, they're not aware of, the extra 2 years. They would look at our schools and then say, well, why are a significant number of students not graduating in 4 years? Yikes, right? And so this actually takes the plain language out of that. And so just echoing what Representative Pryor said is the way that the bill is written now, it wouldn't provide that plain language to parents. It would just say, kids aren't graduating in 4 years without that, and here's what that means. And so some of the concerns I think that have been brought up are that the plain language that you seek, that I've really heard from parents, and I think that is, as I'm looking to have kids, right? It's one of those things I'm like, okay, I need to know this. I'm not seeing that the complicated data being translated into plain language here. I'm seeing it being super simplified, condensed down, and then put into a star rating that actually doesn't give plain language. I guess my question would be then, are there changes that could be made to add plain language that does explain that? And could you work with the bill author on that?
Ms.
I was
Pringle.
going to say, thank you, Madam Chair. I would love to work with the bill author with that. I'm sure the bill author is up for changes and understand that the bill isn't perfect. And as long as everybody's willing to just come to the table and just not throw it out the, window, I think we'll all be just fine. So,
Thank you, Ms. Pringle, for being such a great parent advocate.
Thank you.
That's great to have you. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to come forward and provide support for this proposal? If not, we'll turn to those with concerns, and that would include Dr. Heisted. Would you come forward, please? And is Ryan Vernoche in the audience? If he would also come forward if he's here. Welcome, Dr. Heisted. Please say your name for the record and express your concerns.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is David Heisted. I'm the Executive Director of Research, Evaluation, and Assessment in Bloomington Public Schools. And as you mentioned, I do have some concerns with this bill. I worry about potentially misleading and even harmful uses of data when you distill complex information down to a single number. And those schools, those states that are using letter grades or categorizing like in a star rating, Many times are identifying schools at the top of the list that are majority-only schools, schools that have high proficiency, and the systems that I've seen haven't emphasized how much learning is taking place, especially for students of color, students in poverty, and English language learners. So the methodology that was proposed for ESSA was appropriate for identifying the bottom 10% of the schools in the state. That's the only purpose of that particular model. If you're going to identify high-flyer schools that Latina families are going to want to send their students, their family members to, you have to have a more sophisticated model that actually concentrates on growth from one year to another for each individual student and takes into account the status of the students as a special ed student or an English language learner or a student in poverty. The No Child Left Behind approach to categorizing school was very damaging, I thought, in Minneapolis, where schools that were making good growth were labeled as failing schools. We closed 11 schools, and of those 11 schools, 2 of the schools had been identified through our value-added research as being star schools, making great progress with students who typically don't make progress. So if this type of a star rating goes forward, I hope that it will be done very carefully, as Representative Mariana mentioned, with input from those who are experts in the field of identifying successful schools. I think our state has grown much over the years in its use of data. I think it would be a shame to go back to the days of No Child Left Behind. And I think, we definitely need to make the data accessible to parents and to families. And I think we can do that without having to have a simple star rating system. Thank you.
Are there questions for the testifier? Representative Mariani.
Madam Chair, Dr. Heist, it's good to see you again. I'm wondering, have you looked at the Minneapolis School Finder instrument?
I have
Dr.
not,
Heist.
Madam Chair, Representative Mariani, I haven't had the opportunity to look at the school finder. I think Minneapolis has done quite a bit with dashboards since I left, and I hope that those are helpful to parents in trying to find a good match for their student. In Bloomington, what we have done, and actually in Minneapolis, I did the same. We did beat the odds studies, where we followed the data to find the most successful teachers and most successful schools. And by building in the English language learners special ed status, we were able to identify teachers that are especially effective with diverse populations. We just did a board presentation 2 weeks ago on the kindergarten teacher that beat the odds. And in my written testimony that I can give copies to the committee, I've got a link to that website. So what I'd like to see the state do would be to identify schools that are especially effective with English language learners, schools that are especially effective with students in poverty, as well as schools that are especially effective with white middle class students as well. It would take a more diversified approach than the STAR system that's proposed. But I think that way we could put a face to the great schools that we have in each of our districts and personalize it a little bit more.
Representative Mariani.
Madam Chair, Dr. Heist said, one of the things that Ms. Pringle said, which I think caught a chord with I would submit with everyone here, has to do with whether parents actually have the information in a way that makes sense to them. It seems to me, I propose, that ought to be part of the responsibility of our education systems. I think it's a shared responsibility with parents, but it seems to me that our schools and school districts ought to be more than just laying out information, but actually engaging in such a way that it gets translated. So there's an opportunity to answer questions about whatever system we use, in the dashboard or whatever, that it's connecting with where that parent and that child is at. Give me your quick thoughts on that, and also, because you've been in the Minneapolis schools, and now you're currently, I know I'm going to mess this up.
Yeah,
Are you
I'm in Bloomington now,
Bloomington,
yeah.
I got it right. So are those districts doing anything like that?
Dr. Heister.
Madam Chair and Representative Mariani, yes, that's a big part of my work, is to meet with PTA, with the Somali elders, the Hispanic and African-American parent groups, as well as we have a American Indian group that is blossoming. And they always want me to personalize the pathway information that we have, so I can show individual students that make great progress towards college and career readiness by showing an individual graph, or a group of students who started out really low and improved. And that makes things come alive a little bit more for the parents. So we're always looking at ways of sharing information with parents and community members that they can relate to. And we also have to hold out the challenges where we're not making great progress. And when Bloomington looked at its data for Hispanic students, we were very disappointed that they were not making the same kind of growth as other groups of students in our district. And so we've focused on that with our school planning, with our work with our principals, to try to identify strategies that would be effective. So I think if you share data honestly and openly, you have to look at the challenges as well as the successes.
Representative Mariani.
Madam Chair, in a slightly different tack, under the psychometrics in this bill, would we be able to assign a star rating system to a private school?
Dr. Heister.
Madam Chair, Representative Mariani, currently the private schools are not required to take the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessments, and this bill seems to be just based on test scores. Other approaches to accountability have had multiple indicators, so you could have factors related to social development or to attendance, engagement, things like that. But if the students don't take the test, then you can't measure growth or proficiency.
Representative Pryor, did you have a question for Dr. Heister?
I did. Thank you, Madam Chair. Understanding the use of the MCA, when you, and I'm trying to take the role, I've been a parent, and I was a parent that had to pick out a school district, moving back into Minnesota, picking any place in the metro area, what school we wanted to put our kids in. And so, yes, we did search for data that we wanted to be meaningful, something that really did reflect the quality of the school. So I can definitely put myself in the role of a parent trying to understand where my kids should go to school. Do our MCAs, do they really show a student's development and growth, and how a school nurtures that? Or when you're looking at that internally and talking about schools that are doing a great job at bringing kids up to where they should be, do you use other kinds of measures than the MCA?
Dr. Heister.
Madam Chair, Representative Pryor, when I'm focusing on an area like reading, then what I do is I look at 3 years of continuous data on teachers, and I try to find the teachers that accelerate growth in reading the greatest. And then we focus our videotapes on what it takes to make good readers. But when I was in Minneapolis, worked with Louise Sundin, the union president, We developed a indicator system with 33 different indicators so that we had a robust system for identifying these schools that beat the odds. And then we would put on a big banquet, and we would have the teachers from those schools come and talk about what made the difference. And I remember vividly when Bethune School in North Minneapolis with 95% students of color, 95% poverty, won the award for the highest, and how excited everybody was. And so with a multiple indicator system, you get credit for things other than just test scores. And that was accepted by the teachers as a more fair way of judging their school than simply the test score.
Representative Bly.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in what you were saying, and one of the questions I had earlier on with the testifier this morning was, it's great to collect data and understand data, and data can be very powerful, but number one, it depends on who the data is going to be used by, who's going to be informed by it. And then the more you condense data, in my understanding, the more general it becomes and the less useful it actually becomes. And so if I'm a parent, and kind of as Representative Pryor was mentioning, if I want to know specific things about how my child will perform in those areas, it may not be useful for me to know that this is a star school if I don't know that it's actually going to be a good school for my child. And so it seems to me from what you're saying that it's really perhaps a form of art, or really something that's very challenging to capture data or experience of students in schools and schools, information about schools themselves, and condense it into a way that actually is going to be meaningful. And I'm impressed with what you were describing has happened in Minneapolis. And so that's one of the things I guess that troubles me about this rating. It may be good for parents who want to know where the best school and what neighborhood they might want to live in, but it isn't necessarily going to be informative about what kind of experience is my child going to have in that school. Is that kind of what you're saying, or?
Madam
Dr.
Chair
Husted.
and Representative Bly, yes. A simple example would be my child is struggling in mathematics, and I'd really like a strong math team to work at. But the rating system averages the reading and the mathematics. So you could be extremely high in reading growth and proficiency and extremely low in math. It would average out so that the school would be an average school, but you'd lose that information. So I think we have to work with families on kind of finding the information that's most useful for them. And the example of if I if my child is an English language learner, what I want to know is which schools are showing the greatest progress with those particular schools, not all students in general. So having a more sophisticated view that you can branch out to, I think is very helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Heisted. We have two others who would like to make comments. Mr. Uni from MDE and Ms. Dietrich from MSBA. Please come forward. Welcome, Mr. Oni, and please say your name for the record and begin.
Madam Chair, members, my name is Adosh Uni. I'm the Director of Government Relations with the Department of Education here in Minnesota. First and foremost, I just want to say that the department fully recognizes that there is a need for a tool that's an improvement upon our current system. In our discussions with our ESSA stakeholder groups all across the state, with family members, with students, with community members, with legislators, with business leaders, we've heard that there needs to be more transparent and easier navigable tools than we currently have with our report card. And that's something that we're working towards with this group. But while we seek to improve this data tool, we want to avoid the pitfall of creating something that may be too simplistic with just one or two scores, whether it be a star, a letter, a number, a color. That doesn't really give the parent the necessary context for a school's performance. And I think we've heard a lot of that discussion today. And, you know, this is exactly what we've heard from our ESSA stakeholder groups when we've been talking about the appropriate way to present school performance data and accountability data as we go forward. And I just want to say that we've been working with these stakeholder groups for about 2 years, and this has been a major focus of what they've been giving us feedback on. And they've been doing it through surveys, in person, through detailed memos about what they feel is the best model, and to, I would say, go with this approach that, in the MDE's opinion is too simplistic of approach, would be throwing out all of the input and work that these groups have been engaging in on behalf of a better data system. The participants have noted they do not want an overly complex system that has too many graphs, too many charts stacked on top of each other, too much data to wade through. And that's something that we're sympathetic towards. But at the same time, they have explicitly said they do not want summative letter grades or numbers or stars or colors. They want something in the middle that provides them an easy to navigate tool that says how the district is doing and schools are doing on multiple measures, but that doesn't present them with too many graphs, but also doesn't provide them with any context. And that's something that we're trying to get to in our stakeholder group work right now. One of the things that I would also mention outside of allowing us to finish that work with ESSA stakeholder groups is that some of the measures in this approach, specifically to this bill, don't necessarily align with our ESSA accountability measures, and that's something that we want to make sure. I know that in our discussions with the committee over the years as we've been building up ESSA, there's been an intense focus on let's make sure there's alignment with what we're doing with our accountability measures with ESSA, and especially with how we're looking at our world's best workforce system. And so we want to make sure that every tool that we're using across systems and across users is similar to one another. And we want to make sure that any proposed system that comes forth, if it should be in legislation, should be aligned with ESSA. And just a few of the areas, and I think these have been touched on before, are tracking performance for English language learners and students receiving special education services. We want to look at an ESSA indicator, consistent attendance and chronic absenteeism. That's not present in this model. And also, there's no 7-year graduation rate. I believe the graduation rates were touched on as well. So just to reiterate, we recognize the need for a better tool, but we really want to find that sweet spot in the middle that isn't overly complex and isn't overly simplistic. And we feel that the work with the ESSA stakeholder group is really the method to get us to that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Uni. Welcome, Ms. Dietrich.
Thank
Please
you,
say your
Madam
name for the
Chair
record
and
and
members of the
begin.
committee. My name is Denise Dietrich, and I'm with the Minnesota School Boards Association, and we want to thank you for having the opportunity to speak here on House File 3179 today. As everyone knows, in December of 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act replaced the No Child Left Behind Act. Under the new ESSA law, we welcomed the transfer of authority back to the states. As a result, MDE was charged with developing a statewide accountability plan with meaningful input from stakeholders. We have participated in those stakeholder meetings for the previous 2 years. That does not mean that we like everything about the new plan. We won some and we lost some. However, one message that came out very clear through the 2 years of meetings from stakeholders was that in this new era of school accountability, that there was an opportunity to leave the punitive system of No Child Left Behind. Stakeholders embraced the idea of adopting a reporting system more like a data dashboard that would give a more accurate picture of our schools, as opposed to being categorized into one summative score. What this dashboard will look like, it's not known. The Data Dashboard Subcommittee continues to meet, but we do hope that the data dashboard will be transparent, simple, and an accurate tool for reporting school academic performance for schools, students, and parents. With that, Madam Chair, I will conclude my comments.
Thank you, Ms. Dietrich. Are there any questions for the testifiers? Representative Mariani.
Madam Chair and Mr. Uni, and I don't want us to get into a deep thing here because that could happen pretty easily, but it does seem to me that generally, depending on how this is done, we could run the risk of creating two messages or more to the general public about schools. So in other words, it seems to me that if ESSA requires certain things to be reported out and be factored into our accountability measures, that it's quite possible that using this rating system, which does not fully encompass those ESSA requirements, could produce two different messages to folks. Is that a concern to the department in terms of how do we communicate and represent accurately and helpfully to the public a narrative about a school? And
Mr. Oni?
Madam Chair, Representative Mariani, I would say simply yes. And to add on to that, the measures we've created in our ESSA accountability system have really been created through the expectations of stakeholders throughout the state over a long period of time. And if we had two different accountability systems set up, one that would be the forward-facing one, I think that the expectations would be to look behind what what the bill would require us to do, and they would find that this doesn't account for chronic absenteeism. This doesn't necessarily account for English language learner proficiency and growth, or it doesn't account for our special education, students receiving special education services. And I think there definitely would be some confusion around what are we being held accountable to the federal government for our accountability in our state system, and then what are we presenting as a performance for of our schools to our parents. And I think there would be a misalignment that would definitely be confusing, and I think would create some frustration, and I think would create lack of clarity when the department comes and tries to explain results, and when policymakers try to parse the results and try to square them.
Madam Chair, Mr. Rooney, you've shared that the department is engaging with stakeholders and working on something. You referenced a report card, and I would note, members, I've been here long enough to know that part of the complexity, not all, but part of the complexity of the report card is that we as legislators kept adding things to it. I might have carried some of those bills myself. And so to me, it's a cautionary tale, about legislators doing this kind of work in terms of that prescriptive nature of what ought to be present in a tool to be able to arm the public. It seems to me that that's part of why we have schools, we have, educators, we have parent groups to be able to shape that. It sounds like that's what you're trying to do. My question is when? What's the timing? What's the, when can we expect something powerful and helpful from the Department of Ed relative to this issue?
Mr. Oni?
Madam Chair, Representative Mariani, that's a good question. We have another meeting coming up. We have another meeting coming up soon. And then we have our final meeting for the group, I believe, in June and July. In terms of building out a system, I think as we all are familiar with at this point, building out data systems for the department does take time because we want to get it right. The IT team has to build it out, and our assessments division and school support systems school support divisions have to be involved in the process of building these systems out so we get it right. I don't have an exact timeline. I haven't been involved personally in the meetings in terms of how long it would take to build that system out. I'm not sure if Ms. Dietrich may have some insight participating in those meetings, but I know that our next meetings for the data dashboard committee is in the next week or two and into the summer.
Madam Chair,
Representative Mariani.
to my good friend, Mr. Rooney, that's also part of, I think, maybe anxiety and concern on the part of legislators. I suspect that's part of what motivates Representative Peterson, is that unless we know that there is action that we can see progress, have expectations of, something happening, we're responding to constituents, and that's where we create the temptation for us to step in and be prescriptive. Whether we should or not, another debate, but that's part of it. And so I guess this is sort of my way of asking you to convey that back to the commissioner and to the department. Madam Chair, for Ms. Dietrich, my final question similar to the question I had for Mr. Heisted, from the MSBA's position, what is the level of responsibility for school districts to be able to translate for parents, for community members, vital information about the effectiveness and the appropriateness of schools for those constituents? And do districts have the resources to do that?
Ms. Dietrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Mariani. Reporting information out is critical. Reporting information out that demonstrates strengths and weaknesses of a system and of a student's performance, I think is critical, because we all know nothing really is boiled down to just one score, or a yes or a no, or an A or an F. Do schools have the tools to do that correctly right now? I think when you start looking at some of the ESSA projections about how many schools will be identified for needs improvement or targeted school districts, the department has been, at least in the meetings that I have been in, known to say that that would be about $8 million worth of resources through regional centers of excellence and that type of thing to provide the appropriate help to help all students, all schools get to the proficient level or making progress towards the proficient level. And so do our school districts have those resources right now? I would say to some degree, some may, but to a large degree, we are going to have a lot more schools identified needing help, and we're going to need help to do that.
Thank you, Ms. Dietrich. Mr. Oni.
Madam Chair, I'd like to just build on Ms. Dietrich's point and to an earlier question that Representative Mariani had brought up about confusion. I think this illustrates an excellent point. If we have schools identified for improvement under our ESSA plan, but maybe are scoring well under this new this proposed summative rating system or vice versa, I think that would definitely add to the confusion. So if you see a D, but your school is not receiving support from regional centers because they haven't been identified under our ESSA system, I would have questions, and I would expect parents to have questions, and the school may not be able to explain it, and they may be frustrated with the answers they get back. So that just lends to having systems that are very well aligned, and ESSA is really our guide at this point.
Representative Peterson, closing comments.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members, for this robust discussion, because I do believe that the committee process does help our legislation become better, and I am looking forward to working with all the stakeholders in how we can accomplish that goal. Thank you, Madam
Thank you,
Chair.
Representative Peterson, and for those who have worked with you, we appreciate your efforts, and moving forward, we look forward to the end product, whatever it might be. With that, the chair renews her motion that House File 3178, as amended, be re-referred to the Committee on Education Finance. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay.
Nay.
The motion prevails, and the bill is on its way to Education Finance. Thank you again, Representative Peterson. Representative Dettmer. Welcome to our committee, and to your testifiers. I think we're going to have enough chairs for just about all of them. Matthias, will you make sure there are adequate chairs in the front for all the testifiers?
Oh, well, they changed.
Welcome, Representative Dettmer. We're going to have Representative Barr move House File 2788. The chair will be laying this over. So Representative Barr?
Madam Chair, I'd like to move House File 2788 be laid over for possible inclusion in a later bill. And I'd also like to
Yes.
move the A2 amendment, if I could.
And Representative Barr, we have a, you moved which amendment, the A2?
A2, ma'am?
Yes, Representative Barr moves the A2 amendment. Is there any discussion? I believe this is to ensure that you bring some comfort language, correct, Representative Dettmer?
Madam Chair and committee members, yes.
Yes.
At my committee with the Veterans Affairs Division, we felt that we just needed to get it up to where we don't impose any mandates on our counselors and our schools. So this is comfort language.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I haven't even introduced you yet, but we'll get the bill in the order, and then you'll be able to proceed. Everyone in favor of the A2, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails, and the A2 amendment is adopted. We have the A3 amendment, which I will offer members because we have a technical correction. So the chair moves the A3 amendment with the technical change to be embedded in the amendment. We need to add the conjunction "and" on line 1.2 of the amendment in front of representatives and between. So insert between the quotation marks and representatives the conjunction "and." So it will read, after recruiters, insert "and representatives of organizations promoting careers in the skilled trades." And actually, Representative Rarick, I think you wanted to address this amendment, so will you do so?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And I apologize to the committee. I had missed an email from Ms. Para yesterday. I had a little bit more for this amendment, but this amendment will be just fine. I think as we hear the testimony about our military recruiters, the trouble they're having in getting into schools, the same thing applies to skilled trades and also manufacturing. And I had originally wanted manufacturing to be included. I'll work with the author, Representative Dettmer, to get that in at a later point. But I think we've heard a lot of things from some of these other groups. When these opportunities are offered to kids, there are so many that are looking for it, and they just don't know it's there. So I hope we can add this amendment so that we can include the skilled trades and eventually manufacturing as well.
Thank you, Representative Rarick. With that, the chair renews her motion that the A3 amendment as technically amended be adopted. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those who oppose, nay. The motion prevails, and the A3 amendment is adopted. Again, welcome Representative Dettmer, and to your testifiers. Will you explain 2788 as it is amended?
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. And this is the second time this bill has been heard out of the Veterans Division. And over the interim, I met with the recruiting command, and we have some speakers here, some testifiers here that I'd like to also include here. But just a little background on myself, if you're new to this committee. I used to serve on this committee too, and also Finance Committee. But I'm a 34-year educator at Forest Lake High School, coach there and so forth, and also a 25-year veteran myself. And I just really feel that we need to provide as many opportunities as possible to help the counselors, to provide them resources to help students direct their paths in terms of careers, whether it be in the industry, whether it be with the trades, or whether it be on college degrees and so forth, or the military. We have a lot of resources out there in our communities. And the trades, in fact, this summer I was visiting some of the trades schools where you can have apprenticeships and so forth, electricians, plumbers, and so forth. And I was talking to them, do you have access to schools to come in and share your trades with different schools and so forth? And they say, well, it's pretty tough getting in there. So my whole philosophy with this piece of legislation, if schools are going to have college fairs and open up the schools for, I know the schools that I taught at Forest Lake, we had college fairs and recruiters would come in, colleges would come in, two-year schools would come in, and the trades is something that we need to include. And so with that, my family has benefited from having a good public education. My twin sons went on to West Point afterwards. They're lieutenant colonels now in the military. There's a lot of opportunities out there, and there's a lot of opportunities for funding for education. So with that, I would like to introduce my first testifier, Professor Sherry Turner, and she will introduce herself.
Welcome, Professor Turner. Please say your name for the record and begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Dr. Sherry Turner. I'm from the University of Minnesota. I've taught in counseling and student personnel psychology for almost 20 years. We graduate between 15 and 20 school counselors at the master's level every year. And I'm here to talk about what the needs of the students are from my perspective, and how we might help school counselors further their training and education. To help students make fully informed post-high school choices, they should be exposed to a broad range of college and career options. Many times, school counselors are unaware of those options. That includes military options, that includes the trades, that includes technical types of options. Students need to be aware of military opportunities as both an opportunity to embark on an honorable career of service to the country, and also as an opportunity to receive career training and experience that will allow them to contribute to society and have satisfying careers long after their military service has ended. Students should be made aware of these opportunities early, at least by the 9th grade, so that they can also be made aware of the requirements for enlistment or for various types of post-high school education and training, for eligibility in military assignments they would like to have. In order to successfully transition into military, students need to know that they must graduate from high school. A GED is no longer enough to enter the military. They need to know that they must achieve a minimum score on the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery so that they can plan their academic careers accordingly. They need to plan their high school courses so that they can be more competitive for the military assignments they would like to have, and so that they can assume positions that are critical to the U.S. military mission. Students need to understand both the benefits and obligations of military service in order to make more informed choices. One issue that can preclude this is the full implementation of providing students with these options is the lack of training and experience that school counselors have. In the graduate school programs, we teach broad and general training in theory, human development, academic and career development, crisis counseling, school organization, research and evaluation, etc. School counselors in training learn the more finely nuanced applications of their school counseling practice through practicums and internships in K-12 districts of their choice. At this point, master's level school counselors graduate with varying degrees of knowledge and expertise in military career options. Thus, many school counselors rely on recruiters and education officers to provide their high school students with appropriate information on military options. However, recruiters may not be tapped until students express interest in the military. Without proactive guidance by school counselors, students may not fully understand military opportunities and therefore may not express interest in them.
Thank you, Professor. Representative Dettmer, you have other testifiers?
Yes, Madam Chair, and just tap into that. I know that right now there's 1.3 million current people, men and women, that are serving in our country, just 1.3 million. And that's only 0.4% of our population. So we need to realize that we have an all-volunteer service. We don't have a draft. I hope that never has to come back. And we really believe that what we have here in our service is something that's unique, maybe around the world. So our next testifier is Major Andrew Nicholson, United States Marine Corps, recruiting Twin Cities.
Thanks, sir.
Welcome, Major Nicholson. It's great to have you. Please introduce yourself and begin.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Hey, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and share my insight on how the state of Minnesota is doing in supporting, as the representative just said, our nation's all-volunteer force. My name is Major Andrew Nicholson. I am the commanding officer of Marine Corps Recruiting Command in Twin Cities. I oversee the recruiting effort for the Marine Corps in the states of Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and parts of Wisconsin. So it gives me a great appreciation and ability to see across states and to compare and contrast how Minnesota is doing to the bordering states. The thing that has brought me here today is my concern on the recruiting. If you look at the facts as we see it today, Minnesota has the lowest propensity to serve at a 6% rate. There's only one state in our nation with a lower percentage, and that's Washington State at a 5%. Wisconsin is at a 16% propensity to serve, 10 points higher than Minnesota. So you have to ask yourself why. So in my time on recruiting command, I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out the answer to that question. Why is our propensity to serve, so likelihood for the inclination from a student of wanting to be a Marine or a military service member, so low? And I've come to the conclusion that there's 3 reasons. First reason is the state of Minnesota has no active duty basis. So writ large, kids growing up in the state of Minnesota don't get exposed to the natural military day in, day out through their life. And we can't fix that, obviously, but that leads to my next point, is access to schools. As we see it, there's large disparities in access in our school systems across the state of Minnesota. I've seen access be determined at the district level, district school level. I've also seen access in schools be determined by principals. And what you get from that is disparities across the state. If you look at the student, his opportunity to learn about the military, it's coming from the recruiter. And right now, there's an unfair advantage to, depending on where you're at, but there's an unequal advantage to students based on how their principal or district determines their access, because that ultimately determines their ability to talk to a recruiter and learn about the military and the benefits of serving. The third point is counselors aren't educated. Generally, they are not educated to be able to speak to our students about the benefits of serving in the military. I've seen it firsthand many times. It's a movie that's replayed itself just about every time I go into a high school or community college. The counselors don't have the knowledge, don't have the ability to articulate military service to their students. So in turn, the Marines or the military is the de facto counselor to students. So with that, just to recap, low exposure growing up in school, low access to the students from a military recruiting standpoint, and counselors not having the ability to articulate military service and the benefits that come with it to the students equals low propensity to serve in the state of Minnesota. So this bill gets after, I strongly believe this bill gets after all that, and if we can give our students the opportunity to be better educated on the military, I think our propensity to serve in the state of Minnesota will increase. Thank you.
Thank you
Madam
very
Chair,
much, Major.
just to lead off from that,
Representative Dettmer.
many of the students, when I taught, knew that I was in the military, and they would come to me and sit down with me, and I would just share my experiences and so forth. And I would also tell them it's not for everyone, but I would share some of my experiences and also my son's experiences. And many times the recruiters would come, and they knew who I was. They would come to me right away. And so there is an issue there with, there is an issue there that many times I feel that our recruiters can be resources for our counselors. And I hope that comes to bear. And our next speaker is Captain Young, United States Army Recruiting Command.
Captain, welcome to our committee, and please say your name for the record to begin.
Young Yoon. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of this bill. Up front, I am here to disabuse any misconception that we're trying to force our Minnesotan youth to join the Army. We are wanting to inform our youth to ensure that they are choice ready and they are informed of all the career options that they have available to them, including military service. I testified about 2 weeks ago at the Veteran Affairs Division Committee, and I gave the stats of, the DOD stats of 1%. I guess that dropped recently to 0.4%, which is not an uptick. And also the stats that there's a 35% decline currently in the veteran population, which means that there's going to be less stories to be told, less informed population, and consequently, less informed youth. So I want to provide some stories of my own and what I've experienced in the military. So I enlisted back in 2008 in Dallas, Texas. And I originally enlisted for a 4-year contract, and I thought I was going to get out, use my GI Bill, go to school. And here I am now today, 9 years in service, because there are so many unknown unknowns about the military. It took me 4 years in the military to really understand what military provides. And it's a great career opportunity, and it's a great lifestyle. And that's why I have protracted my contract indefinitely, and I hope to make a career out of this. I also want to talk about my former boss, Lieutenant Colonel Fensky. He's a native here in Minnesota. He was a state champ, wrestling state champ.
From Paynesville, Minnesota.
From Paynesville, Minnesota, yes. Now he's retired here. He's currently an educator at Northwestern University. And as a West Pointer and for the other academies, high school students that have a desire to serve in that capacity at these elite universities, at these elite academies, need to start early in their high school careers. They have to start engaging in the public communities, clubs, and have high GPAs. And if they are, again, in the unknown, we are giving them an unfair advantage as opposed to the other states that do a pretty good job with informing the high schools with all the different career options of the military. My current boss, Lieutenant Colonel Foster, he was the division chief at 82nd Airborne. He is here now as the battalion commander, recruiting operations in 5 states. And he has bought a home here in Minnesota, and his kids go to school in Forest Lake. And I guess the takeaway is that there are many great Minnesota-born military leaders, and they come back here to the state of Minnesota, and they contribute in some fashion or another. They come back home, and when they depart Minnesota, they do great things. So these men had vets in their family back in their time to tell real military stories, not stories that are told by the media. And right now, because of the decline in population of our veterans and only 0.4% of our military serving, our population serving in the military, there is going to be less and less real information about the military. I believe it's going to be more skewed reality that the media portrays. Also, I want to talk about the need for this bill. So back in 2012, across the Minnesota formation for our battalion, we have reduced our manpower, our recruiters, exponentially. It was almost half of our recruiters that have been relocated elsewhere because of the low propensity in this area. I think that's even a bigger reason why we need to educate or have our counselors be able to talk about the military career options because of our recruiters relocating. And they are not as prevalent here in the state of Minnesota as they once were. Meaning that if there's a student in his or her personal learning plan has military career options and wants to know more about the military, we do not have recruiters all the way out in Austin, Minnesota that can provide that information. So again, I think it's very important that our counselors can bridge that bridge that opportunity gap and provide more information about the military career options. And that concludes my comment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Captain. Representative Dettmer.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Captain New, you weren't able to be here this morning. Where were you?
I was at the hospital. My wife has a baby girl on the way, so first girl.
Wow.
Looking forward to it.
And you're here? Well, are you texting her constantly so you know?
I was, Madam Chair, yes.
Madam
She's-
Chair,
She's in
actually,
labor,
he-
correct?
No, not yet.
Oh, okay.
actually, I saw his first testimony. It's about half what it was before, so I'm just
And your other testifier, Representative Dettmer?
Yes, Madam Chair, and again, I think in terms of what it brings to our state when somebody who has gone to, say, to academy or has spent 20 years in the military or to even 6 years, want to listen to it, is that the return on investment in terms of leadership that these young men and women have learned through the experiences in the military. And give you one example, when my wife and I went to West Point, we're set up a Mikey Stadium, and the hats go up for their graduation. We go down there, there was also already corporations down there handing out their business cards saying, come and see us in 5 years, you have a job, because you have a 5-year commitment after West Point. Well, my sons are at almost 18 years now, so I know they're going to work on getting their 20 years in. Just a personal story. Our last but not least testifier here is Dr. Susan Larson. She's the Chief of Education Officer for the United States Army. So.
Welcome, Dr. Larson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, representatives, and fellow citizens of Minnesota. I want to say at the start that I'm the education specialist, but I'm the only person sitting at this table who is not a veteran, nor the wife or spouse of a veteran. I'm somebody who stepped up with a background in higher education because I wanted to help our military and our students. I saw in my own life the first person in my family ever go to college was my great aunt, a Native American, French Canadian, American woman who went to school on the 1944 GI Bill after serving in World War II as a pilot. It made an enormous change in my life and presented an opportunity. And that's really what I want to address, is that this bill will ensure that counselors are prepared to present all options to all students. You are probably aware that only less than 2 out of 10 students, high school seniors, if I took any 10 of them, only 2 of them would qualify physically, would qualify morally, that is to say they had made good decisions all the way around and didn't have a police background, and could pass the entrance test. So the pool of people from whom we can select to serve our country is very small. But one of the greatest, I think, emphasis and benefits of this bill will be to help students understand the diversity of careers in the military. We have, in my branch of service, over 200 different jobs that represent every career cluster, all 16 of them. And one of the problems is that when you talk to counselors, and I'm in schools every week, they say, well, I don't know if I want her to be a soldier. And I said, well, what do you mean? What kind of job? And they said, well, you know, a soldier. And I said, well, do you mean an infantry person? Do you mean an aviation specialist? Do you mean an electric bass player? Or do you mean a phlebotomist? Because all of those are possible jobs in the military. The other part, I think there's a fairness point. Major Richardson pointed out that pointed out that there isn't the propensity. As a taxpayer, I'm concerned that Minnesota students are not claiming their fair share of Department of Defense scholarship money. We are the largest provider of scholarships in the country, and you access those through service. Another thing I hope that this legislation will do for the sake of our country and the sake of the people I serve with is disabuse students and parents of the idea that there is a binary choice, that either you go to the military or you go to college. Again, for my branch of service, it's not an option to not go to college or get post-secondary education. We have a program called the Concurrent Admissions Program, and every student who Captain Yoon or any of my other commanders swears in within 30 days, has to pick, if they don't have a BA or BS already, and by the way, 80% of the young people who come and serve in the Army have some college credit. They have to pick one of 1,900 schools. Actually, they can pick up to 3. And I'm pleased to say that all of the MINSCU schools are part of this program, to come and start their studies once they've finished basic training and advanced training. So, in other words, that's, as counselors can request, parents can cajole, beg, and bribe, but Captain Yoon can issue a lawful order that they will begin that process. Because we know everybody, first of all, there are a couple of truths. Everybody someday is going to be a civilian. No matter how many years you serve, you're going to come out of uniform and be a civilian, and most of our folks are going to come back and be Minnesotans. And the other part is, even if you stay in for 20 years, you're not going to go past sergeant without a higher degree these days. So we are the most educated force ever. Also, the Department of Defense is the largest employer of scientists and engineers in the United States. We need technical folks, from everything from keeping the Mississippi River from overflowing to developing the next invisibility cloaking for our airplanes. All of those things are domestic products. I also encourage us to join other states, such as our neighbor to the west, North Dakota, Iowa, Texas, and Colorado, who are already making similar strides in actively including the military, so that, as Captain Yoon put it, our students are choice ready, that they really are aware of all the possibilities of occupations. And I would say, as far as the trades, I'm often out presenting on the career exploration program, and when I ask young people, do you know what the trades are? Very often I get an answer that that's what they do on Wall Street. There is an amazing knowledge gap. And while you certainly can learn the trades in the armed forces, we also would encourage our partners in career and technical education to have a voice so that young people can have the opportunity to learn about these well-paid, important positions throughout our communities. Finally, I would also like to say that the military is one of the most racially and ethnically diverse organizations in our country. Right now, 40% of our military population is our people of color. Population-wise, 44% of Americans are people of color. So we mirror the population quite well. In conclusion, I'd like to thank you folks for your support in making all of our students Minnesota future ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Larson. Representative Mayquade has a question for one of the testifiers. Representative Mayquade.
Madam Chair, Major Nicholson, I think the Adjutant General of the National Guard would be mad at me, he's a constituent of mine, if I didn't ask if this 6% of our propensity to participate included National Guard or not.
Major Nicholson.
Madam Chair, thank you. Representative, sorry.
Mayquade.
The 6% is willingness at the student level in high school to want to serve. So yes, that includes service and National Guard and the active duty forces. And I believe I was asked that question last time I testified, and I incorrectly gave you an answer. So willingness to serve.
Thank you.
Are there other questions for these testifiers? Representative Bly.
Thank you. I was a director at an alternative school, and I did have recruiters come in occasionally. But another thing I think that was very useful, I don't know if this is something that you consider, but we had our students take the ASVAB test, and certainly the presentation before the testing, but after the excellent information they got after the testing was really important and helpful. Now, I wouldn't say necessarily that all of my students would be eligible, but it was really informative, and I appreciated the time that people gave to come in and talk to my students, and it was a good thing.
Thank you, Representative Bly. That is a good test. Yes, yes, indeed. Dr. Larson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I so appreciate you bringing that up, because the ASVAB as it is used in the high schools, is not a military enlistment program. It is a career exploration program, which the Department of Defense provides at no cost to schools or parents. And we brief civilian careers, because as I said, someday all of us are going to be civilians. And I absolutely support this no-cost, budget-neutral way for all of our students to be exposed to areas that they might not have otherwise thought of. And I want to share with you a quick story about 2 students down in Houston, Minnesota. I had been called down specifically by the counselor because she had a bunch of students who she thought were at risk of dropping out their senior year. And I tested. There were 3 young men who scored, 2 of them scored a 9, it goes from 0 to 100, okay? 2 of them scored a 99, and 1 of them scored a 97 in their technical areas, their ability to think in 3 dimensions. These were the same young men who were at risk of dropping out. And I want to tell you, the 2 99s didn't sit next to each other, just in case you were wondering or have experience in schools. And I talked to the guys afterwards, and I said, what were you, I started to tell them, do you know of all the opportunities you have in the trades, in the military? You have the ability to think in 3 dimensions is something that I, as a Berkeley PhD, will never have. You are smarter today than I will ever be in that area. And they said, you know, this is the first time in school we've ever gotten a number that showed that we were smart. This is the first time we ever took a test where we were really good at something. I'm pleased to tell you that all 3 of those young men graduated from Houston. There's definitely value to the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Larson. That's a great testimony to the ASVAB because it's a test I have great respect for, too. We have a couple who are concerned about this proposal, so I think some will have to vacate Representative Dettmer so they can come forward to express concerns. Mr. Uni and Mr. Loesch. Welcome, Mr. Uni. Please say your name for the record again. And
Madam Chair, members, my name is Adosh Uni, Director of Government Relations at the Department of Education. Thank you for the opportunity to make some comments here. I was able to connect with Representative Dettmer earlier today and electronically last night, and I think the conversations will be continuing going forward. The broad thrust of the bill is in no way a concern of ours. It's really the last provision around continuing education for our counselors and non-classroom teachers and others who work with counseling around academic counseling, career counseling, and college counseling, that training in counseling around or training in armed force career options would be sufficient to complete all of their professional clock hours around professional growth. We have some concerns about that superseding the requirement to get training on cultural competency, as well as working with English language learners and their varied needs. I would feel that just as in the classroom, in the counseling setting as well, these educators and counselors would benefit from having this training working with students of varied needs who either come from different cultural backgrounds as well as have different language needs. And I would feel that, you know, people of different language backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds would also have an interest in armed forces careers. I'm not fully fluent on what the training, what the armed forces training has in terms of those areas, but we know that those aspects are pretty important for an educator's ability to serve all students that they work with.
Dr. Larson, response to that?
If I might respond, I think that's a reasonable question. I would first say that certainly by serving, any student would join the most culturally and ethnically diverse organization in the country, so they would get a quick introduction to what multicultural means in an organizational set. And I don't believe it was Representative Dettmer's intent to say that this would be all of their current technical education. In fact, we were talking a little bit about it, and it could be presented in a very budget-neutral way For example, by offering CTE courses at the annual Minnesota State Counselors Meeting, which is held every year up in Gull Lake at the first week in May. That's one opportunity. We could also offer no-cost classes at Education Minnesota, a place where we would expect teachers and counselors to be attending. There are also opportunities for distributed learning through websites and through a curriculum that, again, we could develop that would present a broad opportunity from all branches of service, not just one. So I think that we would never dream of saying that learning about the military would replace any other set of skills necessary to work with a diverse group of Minnesota students. However, I think it would be very important exactly for students who are not familiar with American societies, with our tradition of service and military service, to have those options, particularly as a funding mechanism for higher education.
Mr. Uni?
Madam Chair, committee members, I definitely appreciate the consideration there. I would just say in that paragraph, the only possible way to go at an alternative route currently around doing explicitly around cultural training and cultural competency and working with English language learners is providing your summative evaluation over the course of the 3 years, which one would assume is a rigorous analysis of the teacher's performance over the prior 3 years, which would also involve, as we've seen, working using tools of cultural competence and working with varied needs in English language learners, because we know that those requirements are spread across our educator statutes. I know we've spread those across since 2014, particularly with the LEAPS Act, and then in the prior few years around cultural competence. I think maybe we can work with the author and the advocates on having continued language there. I know that having the language around cultural competence and English language learners was a very important priority for the commissioner when we were discussing the new licensure system. Having that there and present as a requirement for all, I think would be a priority. So maybe we can work with the author and the advocates about how to maintain that in the system.
Thank you, Mr. Uni. I'm going to go to Mr. Loesch, and then you could say something in closing comments. Mr. Loesch, welcome.
I'll be brief, I assure you. Madam Chair and members, thank you. My name is Jake Loesch. I'm a lobbyist with Goff Public and representing the Minnesota School Counselors Association today. I have had the opportunity to talk with Representative Dettmer about the bill, and we really appreciate his amendment to move to more permissive language. I think it does respond to really our major concern about extra responsibilities on the counselors. That's certainly something that we always look at when we're reviewing legislation. As many of you have probably heard, Minnesota faces a pretty extreme lack of school counselors. According to the most recent available data, we have one counselor for every 723 students. That's about the 4th worst ratio in the country, and it really hasn't been getting any better. So it's something that's a big concern of ours. Counselors work tirelessly every day despite those overwhelming workloads to meet the needs of their students. But the reality is that there's just not enough of them in our schools. And so any kind of additional requirements on their time are certainly a concern. But as I mentioned, we really appreciate that the language has been amended. In fact, I did just want to say that a group of Minnesota school counselors recently traveled to a Marine educators workshop in February with the goal of understanding the process that students would need to enter the military and the Marines and about all the educational and work opportunities there. So despite their overwhelming workloads, I know that counselors do have the best interests and are trying hard to be sure that they're providing students with all the information that they can. While we remain a bit hesitant overall that the language is necessary, we certainly understand the intent and appreciate the opportunity to continue working together. I think particularly on anything that we could pair with this that would increase students' access to counselors, because that really is a primary concern. Thank you.
Representative Rarick, do you have a question for any one of these? Okay. Dr. Larson.
Just to briefly address that, we appreciate, too, how hard our counselors work. And we feel that this legislation will encourage them to bring in the subject matter experts who are the recruiters into the room so that they don't have to be the sole be-all, end-all source of knowledge. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that we also will be holding an educator workshop 19 through 22 June to Fort Bragg North Carolina, where the Adjutant General is a Minnesota native. And we will look forward to welcoming educators, counselors, and even representatives if they would like to attend and learn more about educational opportunities with the Army. Thank you.
Representative Dettmer, closing comments. Representative Burke, did you have? Sure, of course, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to thank Representative Dettmer for bringing this bill. I spent a lot of time this last summer talking to a lot of people in the building trades and in manufacturing, and this is exactly what they were asking for. Access to counselors and asking that counselors be made aware. And when I approached Chair Erickson earlier this year about my idea, she mentioned you're already doing this and connected me with you, and I really, really appreciate you accepting the amendment to bring this on. This is exactly what kids need, is just to be made aware, and we do need to have our counselors and teachers, they're coming from a background where they're not necessarily exposed to this, so any help we can get to them to help our kids find out about these opportunities is great, so thank you.
Representative Mariani.
Madam Chair, I'll be brief because I know we're pressing on time, but I do want to pick up on that last note that Mr. Uni raised, and I want to encourage you, my good friend Representative Dettmer, to work on some language here. As Ms. Larson said, she doesn't believe it's your intent to replace current training with this, and I think we could probably pretty easily write that specifically into statute. There also might be other ways for us to get at how do we help equip counselors as opposed to just tell them what to do. We should also perhaps look at other parts of legislation that provide resources for counselors to be able to acquire this kind of useful information. So just a word of encouragement to my good friend Representative Dettmer to work on that language.
Thank you, Representative
Madam
Mariani.
Chair and Representative Marani, I know my years in the military and also as an educator, you learn to roll with the punches, and you learn to listen to people, and you learn to make adjustments as you go. And I know we'll be working with the department here and also our research to tweak the language so that it fits just right for what we're trying to do here. And before we leave here, I think most of the legislators, they know Officer Fox, that he's a trooper that stands in front of the chamber as you go in. He has a daughter named Brianna, and 2 years ago, she came into my office, and her father said that I was a retired warrant officer. She came in, and she sat down, and she made an appointment to come in and sit down, and she says, I want to fly helicopters. Okay, because the Army has a high school to flight school program. And my job as a warrant officer was to tell pilots, you don't fly in that area because there's enemy weapons there. But anyway, so we sat down and just talked about the military. I just wanted to see if she really, really knew what she was talking about. And she had done her research and so forth. And so she went off to basic training. And from basic training, first she signed a contract that the Army would provide high school to flight school program. She went to basic training, then off to Fort Rutger, Alabama. I spent many weeks at Fort Rutger, Alabama. I don't want to be there in August or July, but she just completed Warrant Officer Candidate School. She's a wobbly one, we call them, and now she's training to be a helicopter pilot. And her father picked me up before going into the chamber the other day. He pulled out of his pocket a coin, because when you graduate from warrant officer school, you get a nice warrant officer coin. Well, I have that, and she gave me a coin, so it's pretty neat, pretty neat. So there's a lot of opportunities out there for young people, men and women. So thank you so much.
With that, the chair lays over House File 2788 as amended for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill. Thank you very much to all the testifiers. Representative Kunesh-Podein.
Madam Chair, well, she's going.
Representative Bly.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to Mr. Heller handed me some documents about, related to the online appearance of some of the materials. I wonder if we could just have the page.
Give them to the page.
Bring that to you, yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you again, Major and Captain, for taking time to be with us, and to Professor Turner and Dr. Larson for joining us twice today. You've learned a lot about what we do at this place, and we appreciate you so much.
I'll keep us going here, won't I?
Representative Kunesh-Podein, you're going to be moving 3361, or re-referring it to the Committee on Education Finance, if you'd like to make that amendment at this time, or that motion.
So moved, Chair.
Representative Kunesh-Podein moves that House File 3361 be heard now and then re-referred to the Committee on Education Finance. Welcome to the testifying table. Please say your name for the record and begin.
Good afternoon or good evening. I'm Representative Mary Kunesh-Podein. Very happy to be able to present this bill. This is my very first bill that I've presented, and so I'm very proud that this is the one that I'm doing. A little bit of history behind it. About a year ago, a friend of mine brought this very lovely lady into my office, and Sherry Schumos told me her story. Sherry had a son. As you can see, right here is a picture of him. His name was Jake. And Jake fell into that rabbit hole of addiction around opioids. And after much struggle, Sherry lost her son to opioid addiction or overdose. And so she asked me, or she told me about this incredible foundation that she had put together. It's called For Jake's Sake, and how they were just determined and bent on getting the word out there about the struggle and the issues around opioid addiction. And as we know, Minnesota is dealing, well, the nation is dealing with severe opioid situations. Opioid-related deaths are on the rise, and opioids are highly addictive along with heroin. Between 1999 and 2015, more than 200 folks have died from opioid-related overdoses. And unfortunately, we have two mothers here who had that very somber experience. And so what Sherry brought to me was a request that we, as a legislature, take some opportunity to incorporate into our school curriculum opioid and addiction education and awareness. And much like some of the other legislation that we've passed around Aaron's rule or Aaron's law, around sexual abuse, and Representative Jessup's bill and Representative Pryor's bill on sex trafficking, it's important that we take use of the time that we have in schools to make our students aware of the downfalls of these different situations. And we would ask that we would incorporate this legislation into fruition. So this bill requires school districts to include substance misuse prevention instruction into the health curriculum for certain grades. And those grades are 5th grade, 6th grade, 8th, 10th, and 12th, and encourage our districts to incorporate and integrate substance misuse prevention instruction into existing curriculum and programs. What I would do now is turn this over to Sherry. I'd like her to share with you her story, and then we also have Bailey Belter to give us some information around that. Carla Peterson is right here. She is the head of the For Jake's Sake Foundation. And then we have Lisa McCullough, who will share her story as well.
Well, welcome everyone to the table, and Please say your name for the record and begin.
Sherry Schmaus. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today to testify. We lost Jake at the age of 21 from a heroin overdose, and our life was shattered. We had no idea that Jake was going through what he was. He hid it so well. He had so much life to give. He was so smart. He was kind. He was lovable. He was athletic, and he was good looking. And everybody liked Jake. People drew to Jake because he just had this infectious smile. And Jake loved to hunt. He loved to fish. He was on the basketball team. He wrote for the school paper. Jake had everything going for him. Jake could have been anything he wanted to be until he fell into this awful addiction of opiates. He had told me once that if he would have known how addictive and how this opiates change the chemistry of your brain, that he would have never tried it. But he did not have any idea, and I've heard that from so many people that I've talked to in the last 4.5 years, the kids and stuff, that we didn't know. We didn't know how bad this was. This is an evil drug. And so in honor of Jake, we started the foundation, and we've been bringing awareness to communities. We have, Jake had once told me that he was a prisoner in his own body, that he didn't have control of his life anymore. And Jake was, like I said, amazing young man. He could have been anything. Our lives have changed forever. My husband found Jake on the floor, and he had to try to give CPR. And to have known that he could not save Jake, he has to live that every day of his life. And it's just, our hearts just are breaking, and we need to do something positive. We need to help our youth. We need to get education in there, so our youth are our most vulnerable people, and we just want to stop this epidemic. And thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Ms. Schmaz, and our hearts go out to you and your family. Your son sounded like, all the sons we love, and so we appreciate your taking the time to share that personal testimony. The next testifier should be, please say your name for the record and begin.
Good evening, Madam Chair and Representatives. I am Carla Peterson, and I am with the For Jake's Sake Foundation. And I'd like to thank you for this opportunity for us to testify today. Opiate use and abuse is a great concern to me, and I'm excited that the passing of Jake's Law can actually address this local epidemic by getting comprehensive evidence-based substance misuse prevention curriculum into Minnesota's primary and secondary education systems. You are familiar with Senator Eaton's and Representative Baker's stories. You just heard Sherry Schmaus, a mother's story, and I know you have heard many more heart-wrenching stories of families losing loved ones. You already know why this topic is so important, but I'd like to share just 3 very sobering facts. Fact: every day, 4,000 teens between the ages of 12 to 17 try an illicit drug for the first time. Fact: prescription drugs are the current drug of choice among 12 to 13-year-olds, and we now know that when their supplies become scarce, heroin is the drug of choice. Fact: 90% of drug addicts state that they started using drugs before 15 years of age. These statistics clearly demonstrate that our current methods and techniques to address substance misuse within our educational system is not being effective. Minnesota does not have state academic health education standards. Therefore, each school district can decide which curriculum they choose to use, the intensity and the frequency, creating a huge void within our state health education classrooms. Some students may be getting like 30 minutes in 6th grade and then again in 8th grade and then maybe in 10th grade or so, but a lot of times it becomes an elective, so it's just a choice. And so you know that we're not reaching all students. And so, you think about this. This means that our children are getting an estimated 1, 2, maybe 2.5 hours total of instructional time over a 6-year period on substance misuse and abuse. Research has stated that the way to change behavior is to change the mindset. And this cannot happen with such limited time is being spent discussing the dangers of drugs, and particularly those falling within the family of opiates. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, has defined 3 critical components that they feel is required for a successful drug prevention initiative based on years of experience. And they consist of 1, you have to start early. 2, have to have consistent messaging. 3, a child must have frequent conversations throughout 5th to 12th grade with a variety of peers and adults. It's about equipping everyone's toolkit with the necessary tools and resources, and Jake's Law will provide those tools and resources to teachers, students, parents, and coaches to ensure that these 3 critical components are achieved successfully. Jake's Law will allow us to do 3 main things: to create a statewide substance misuse K-12 curriculum task force to develop a consistent approach to a comprehensive, evidence-based substance misuse prevention initiative to be delivered throughout a few selected schools or charter schools during the 2018 and 2019 school year. This task force can be comprised of teachers, educational administrators, parents, mental health and healthcare professionals, and state-level departmental staff. The students, though, are really key, and we need to hear their voices. And I think earlier today in one of our other proceedings, we heard that, we as parents, we kind of think we've got this figured out, we know what's best for our kids, and yet we're really understanding that the kids want to be involved because they do have their own perspective, and I think they have the knowledge that will really help us be able to be the most effective at reaching them. And that's one of the reasons why we have partnered with the Minnesota Youth Council, who we have a representative here today to speak as well, so that we can have this feedback from across Minnesota. And last, to formalize and administer statewide assessments and evaluations providing credible data that will resonate and be pertinent for all educators throughout Minnesota in our fight to eradicate teenage drug use. And lastly, it will provide the necessary infrastructure to make this an easy transition into the classrooms through teacher training, pre-developed lesson plans, multiple delivery systems, and tools and resources for teachers, coaches, students, and parents. I've been working with some teachers from ISD 11 and health instructors, and they said, it's really hard for us to infuse some new, 1, 2, 3 days into our already packed schedule. And that's why we really would like to look at exploring to getting into different discipline areas such as social studies, the sciences, psychology, so that the kids do get it for the 5th, 6th, 8th, 10th, 12th years, but it maybe not be explicitly just in health education classes, because we know that can burden those particular teachers. But it also allows for a whole different perspective to be approached. Doing chemistry tests or so on different chemicals and equating it to what happens with your brain. There's talking about social norms and belief systems and social studies, so we know that we have a lot of different ways that we can approach this to achieve what this bill is really trying to depict. Children need to be educated on the dangers of drugs in general, but especially within the topic of prescription medication, opiates and heroin. Opiates are so lethal. They're so life-altering, which we heard from Sherry, particularly here, and our youngest assets, our children, are not being informed about the highly toxic ramifications of experimenting with these types of drugs. The highest demographic of abusing and overdosing right now is between the 18 and 25-year-olds. This alone should motivate us to realize that we are not doing enough within our primary and secondary educational systems. They do not understand what these drugs are really all about. They're equating it to alcohol, even maybe marijuana. You and I already know that a child's brain does not fully develop until their mid-20s. Therefore, the impact of drugs on their cognitive development during their teenage years could really impact them forever. And we, as caring and responsible adults, need to demonstrate our commitment to their safety and well-being. In conclusion, as I stated before, adoption of Jake's Law is extremely important because Minnesota school districts do not have a statewide academic standard for substance misuse prevention curriculum, which is creating a huge vacuum for disproportionate and inconsistent learning efficacy across Minnesota. If we really are passionate in eradicating teenage substance misuse, we must have a more intentional approach and a standardized system for the delivery of substance misuse prevention instruction throughout Minnesota education. Jake's Law will get us started on the right path for reform. We need your support, so please support Jake's Law and vote yes, so that we can truly make a difference in all of our children's lives across Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Peterson. And then I think before we hear from the Youth Council, we'll hear from the other mom.
Okay, I don't have much of a voice, so I'm
Be sure
gonna
you
be real-
speak into the microphone. Say your name and
My name is Lisa McCullough. Sorry about my voice, but the main reason I am here today is this is my son, Robert. I'm here with Sherry today to encourage you to support and pass the Jake's bill. I lost my son, Robert, from an overdose, and Robert started using heroin at the age of 15. Having a lot more information and education in our schools about the use of heroin and effects of heroin and other chemical use could have helped. The younger the kids are educated about heroin and other opioids, could stop the demand of this killer drug. Please consider passing Jake's bill. Thank you.
thank you, Mrs. McCullen. Thank you for your personal testimony as well. And my heart goes out to you as a mom who has lost a child. And then we have Ms. Bolter from the Minnesota Youth Council. Welcome.
Thank you.
Please say your name and begin.
Chair Erickson and members of the committee, my name is Bailey Belter, and I'm on staff with the Minnesota Youth Council, which is an initiative of the Minnesota Alliance with Youth. The Minnesota Youth Council is the official youth voice to the state government here in Minnesota, and in fact, there's no other state with a group like the one we have here. I'm speaking on behalf of youth members as they are in extracurricular activities right now and could not make the rescheduled hearing time. However, one of our youth members, Jacob Just from way up in Morris, he wrote and submit a letter to the record. It should be in your folder right now. And so I recommend that you take time to read this sometime today. Youth members of the Minnesota Youth Council voted overwhelmingly to support House File 3361 relating to opioid education, which was created by the For Jake's Sake Foundation. Our group had the privilege of meeting with Sherry, Jake's mom, and hearing their story of how opioids affected their life and loved ones. Both metro and rural students in our group really connected to this bill, especially those in Bemidji, Wilmer, and Morris, as you'll read in Jacob's letter. I was personally surprised by how many in our group had been touched by someone with an opioid addiction, and some had even lost a loved one from it. Our students had no idea that just one hit could take your life, and they didn't know it was so much more potent than other drugs. Most have never, or had never even talked about it in school or to the level of detail that it needed. So our young people and young people in general want to talk about hard topics. So we must not shy away, but actually do the opposite and lean into having these tough conversations so that students can not only learn, but feel safe and comfortable talking about an issue like this that often goes not talked about, but are obviously very much affecting the communities in which they live. If we have learned anything from the past few weeks, young people want change and are willing to let us know despite some pretty uneven power dynamics. It's our job now as adults in positions of power to decide if we want to put a stop to stop preventable deaths that affect so many communities and ultimately our young people in the state. The Minnesota Youth Council supports House File 3361 and urges this body to pass this measure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Bolter. Are there questions for our testifiers? Representative Pryor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am curious right now in Minnesota, are there school districts that are effectively using the tools that you've outlined as being successful programs? And do we have data to show if they do have less abuse because of that?
Ms. Peterson, can you answer that? Or Ms. Bolter?
Sure. We have been connecting with a variety of different schools, and like I said, because there's no standardized, they all are just going online, finding the stuff, because obviously most of the information they currently have don't even address opiates. So they're going online and finding the different resources. So yes and no. The Robert Crown Center for Heroin has created a online interactive computer type of program. It's been very successful. Illinois and Ohio are states that have already adopted it. It's already vetted through the CDC. It meets their national health education standards. We are looking at hoping to utilize that, incorporating that into some of our schools as well, because they do have a number of years of data and studies to be able to demonstrate that it is a very effective resource. NIDA, SAMHSA, they have years of research. They have product as well that we are encouraging and that we will be incorporating into our curriculum package as well.
Thank you, Ms. Peterson. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to testify with support or concerns? Representative Kunesh-Podein, I like the fact that you included 5, 6, 8, 10, and 12, because we know as teachers, repetition is so important, and the more the children learn this and understand it, the better. So I guess we're ready for closing comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here to share your stories and share the resources that we have available. We know that this epidemic is not going away anytime soon. It wraps itself around the most inexperienced, guileless members of our communities, and as a teacher, as a parent myself, as a legislator, I feel like it's my responsibility to do what I can to ensure that we are addressing this very sad and serious situation. And I appreciate the opportunity to share all of this with you. There's been a lot of work between all of these folks. Sherry and her crew have been unrelentless in pursuing this issue. And so I would ask for your support at this time.
The chair renews Representative Kunesh-Podein's motion that 3361 be re-referred to the Committee on Education and Finance. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the bill is on its way, but I'll probably include it, or I'll tell you, I'm going to include it, the policy part in the omnibus bill as well.
Thank you.
Then it'll get a dual.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And thank you, moms and others. This is just, very tear-jerking testimony to know that, you've lost a child, but are prevailing in your efforts to make sure that others can learn. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Representative Jurgens. Welcome, Representative Jurgens. The chair moves House File 2724 to be included in a possible omnibus bill. Representative Jurgens, please say your name for the record and explain the content of 2724.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Representative Tony Jurgens from District 54B.
Please proceed.
Madam Chair, the legislature made school lunch shaming illegal in 2014. Unfortunately, we learned back in November that it still happens. In addition to news reports of students having their meals dumped in garbage because their lunch account had a negative balance, I was also made aware of cases in other districts. My bill strengthens the law to hopefully put an end to this practice. House File 2724 directs the Department of Education to coordinate and review school meal policies. It requires schools to post to its website a school meals policy that clearly communicates meal charges, whether or not the school uses a collection agency to collect unpaid debt, and it must ensure that once a meal is placed on a tray, it may not be withdrawn from the student, whether or not the student has an outstanding meal account balance. The policy must be well-defined and maintain the dignity of students by prohibiting lunch shaming or otherwise ostracizing the student. This extends to any third-party school the school contracts with for meal services. This bill requires MDE to post a model school policy to notify schools that their policies must be approved and posted annually. If a school does not adopt and post a policy, the 12.5-cent reimbursement and 52.5-cent reimbursement will go into an unpaid school lunch account. This bill creates an unpaid school lunch account to receive these payments, as well as any other payments or donations to the account. At the end of each school year, the Commissioner will distribute proportionally to schools with unpaid lunch balances. This bill requires schools to provide meals in a respectful manner, and that reminders for payment must not demean or stigmatize a child. And finally, for the purposes of revenue recapture, school districts are included as a claimant agency. Madam Chair and members, I recognize that it's the parent's responsibility to provide an adequate meal or funding for the child's lunch account. But if a parent is unable to do so for any reason, that's not the child's fault. Free and reduced meals are available to those who apply and qualify. I've met with several stakeholders who might testify today with varying levels of support. My hope is to continue those discussions and fine-tune this bill as needed. The goal is that a child who wants a school lunch is provided one and is not stigmatized because of a past due lunch account. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Jurgens. And you have some testifiers, correct?
There are some
Is Jessica
testifiers.
Webster in the audience and Colleen Moriarty? Welcome to the testifying table. Yes, I think if you surround Representative Jurgens, that's the best strategy.
You're surrounded.
Please say your name for the record and begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members. My name is Jessica Webster. I'm a staff attorney with Legal Aid, and I'm here in support of Representative Jurgens' bill. At least I support the spirit and direction of the bill. I do think it's a stronger bill than what the Department of Education has come forward with, and I really appreciate that he has been open to meeting with me several times with about my concerns, and he's listening, so I appreciate that. I still have some concerns the way the bill is drafted, that I have some concerns with the enforcement. I'm not sure that the policies having to be posted to a website and being collected by the Department of Education is actually going to stop some of these practices that we're seeing statewide. Legal Aid has filed a data practices request with every district statewide twice now, in 2014 and this fall. And I do think that we're moving in the right direction. I think I'm heartened by the number of districts that state in their policy they will always feed a hot lunch to a child that requests a meal, or they will provide an alternate meal that's not just, in 2014 we saw crackers or carrot sticks, and now we see a peanut butter sandwich or cheese sandwich and fruit, veggies, milk. So the school districts are trying with the alternative meals, even though we still have some concerns about those being stigmatizing to kids. But I do think that we're moving in the right direction. There's still a significant number of districts that have written policies that allow for turning children away with nothing, and that includes elementary school children. When I press superintendents about some of these policies, most superintendents will say, oh, we'll never do that, or we've never done that before. We'll always make sure there's something for the child to eat. But the written policies are troubling. And I think that we need to have more conversations about what a model policy actually should include and what are best practices statewide that some districts are using to make sure that kids are fed. And I will say that this is not an urban, rural issue. I see, if you're a child in Hutchinson, Alexandria, Duluth, Minneapolis, Cannon Falls, there is a guarantee that you will always receive the hot lunch. So I'm not entirely sure, other than a commitment from a school board, a superintendent, a principal, a district, what is in the water in some of these districts that are making sure that this is a priority, and what schools are saying, no, this is not our problem. So I look forward to working with Representative Jurgens more, and I would just hope that there is some stronger enforcement in making sure that all children are fed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Webster. Ms. Moriarty?
Good evening, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Colleen Moriarty, and I'm the Executive Director of Hunger Solutions Minnesota, and I'm here tonight to speak in favor of this bill. Hunger Solutions Minnesota has worked actively. We're a statewide hunger relief agency, and we've worked actively with Legal Aid, Legal Services Advocacy Project, the state, and the governor's office to abolish school lunch shaming for the last number of years. To say that we were bitterly disappointed in some of the recent revelations about some of the practices in the state would be an understatement. It's heartbreaking to think that, as Representative Jurgens quoted, that an adult issue is taken on the backs of the children who are school children in our state. We really look for renewed vigilance to make sure that children are at the heart of the policies, not paperwork, not streamlining administrative guidelines, but that we clearly state that children need to be treated with respect and that families need to be treated with respect in the way that we collect fees and the way that we address this issue. We know that studies that have abounded throughout this country show that there's been a reduction in absenteeism with proper nutrition, that learning ability increases, and that proper nutrition is something that should be available to all school children and to all children in our country. And we continue to worry about the uneven and practices that still exist within the state, and we want to make sure that we support every active bill that closes loopholes and makes sure that the children in our state are receiving the same lunch throughout the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. Members, do you have any questions for these testifiers? Representative Mariani.
Sure, very quickly, and I will admit I'm feeling a little embarrassed that I don't know the answer to this, but I'm just wondering, and Madam Chair, if we don't want to get into this in this committee, it's okay, deeply, but what is the legal responsibility in statute in Minnesota in regards to schools having a responsibility to feed students? What are the parameters there?
Representative Mariani, we do have, I think, MSBA coming forward shortly, so maybe they would explain that. But either testifier want to address that, Ms. Webster or Ms. Moriarty?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, the National School Lunch Policy actually is a voluntary policy within our country. It was most recently funded and really reinvigorated in the 60s by Senators Dole and McGovern, along with the food stamp reissuance. So it is a voluntary policy, though, in our country.
Chair, my only comment about that is I'm obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but I am empathetic with Representative Jurgens' bill, with the department's desire, with the witnesses here. I just wonder how much of what we wrestle with might rest on whether or not we have the legal ability to powerfully enforce. I mean, setting an expectation, absolutely. But I'm wondering if part of what gets in our way is whether or not there are limitations to what we can legally enforce the school district relative to access to food. So I'm just kind of wrestling with what the parameters are with that.
Madam Chair, members of the committee,
Ms.
I would
Moriarty.
say that the question really becomes one of the transaction, doesn't it? It's one of how the collection of the funds is enabled. And really, I think some clarification about whose bill it is. Is it the children's bill or is it the parent's bill? And who has the responsibility of paying it, or the family or guardian? I think that is, as a commerce issue, even something that we can look at.
Representative Jurgens, any comment before I release those two testifiers and bring up those with concerns?
No, go ahead, ma'am.
With those with concerns, I believe are the department and MSBA, if you would come forward and express any concern you might have about this proposal. Thank you, testifiers, very much for being here this morning, and at least Ms. Webster, I know, was here this morning. Thank you for coming back. Welcome, Ms. Dietrich, and as usual, welcome, Mr. Uni. And Ms. Dietrich, why don't you lead off? You heard that question from Representative Mariani. I don't know if you want to address it, but we're happy to have you here to speak.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committees. I want to thank Representative Jurgens for addressing the issue of unpaid student meal debt.
Will you move the microphone closer to you? Or you move, yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. At MSBA, we are committed to ensuring that no child in Minnesota is demeaned or stigmatized when the parent or guardian has failed or is not able to provide money to pay for a child's meal, as the 2014 law requires. And with that, I would also like to include a reminder for members and those of you who weren't here that in 2014, the legislature put forth, I think, $3.5 or $3.75 million in the school lunch program, which then eliminated we still use the category of reduced, but it allowed for free meals for free and reduced students. So I think it's really important to note that when we're talking about this, that we are talking about students who do not qualify for free and reduced. So I just think that's really important. So in response to this, however, we all know that there still have been issues since 2014. And in response to this issue, MSBA developed a model policy 534 on unpaid meal charges. We believe that this policy addresses the needs of local school boards and many of the concerns in this bill. There are components to this bill that are not contained in our model policy, and we would like to point those out so that as we together, we discuss the best, the most respectful, the most child-centered approach to policymaking, that we are giving local districts the authority to determine what is best for their community. The first item that I would like to point out is the expanded role of the commissioner in this bill. On line 2.7, the commissioner would be required to coordinate and review local policies. We are not aware of any other policies that the commissioner coordinates and reviews. And so I would ask the committee, is this a precedent that we want to start? Do we really want the commissioner to have that role? Later in the bill, on line 3.5 and beyond, the commissioner must develop a model policy. This seems contradictory to coordinating and reviewing the local policies. And also, he or she must annually notify districts that their policies must be approved and posted. Also, there is a model policy that many school districts have adopted and is working for their students and community. Second, on line 3.11 through 22, this would bar districts without a policy from receiving their payments from the National School Lunch Program. This may financially punish some school districts that may have the most generous, the most kind practices in place. There may be no shaming at all, and there may be very generous in their practices. Yet they would have money withheld by the commissioner to retain and redistribute to other districts due to lack of having a policy only. In Section 2, Subdivision 1 on line 216, asking the school districts to post their policy and their processes for unpaid lunch debt is reasonable, provided the local district determines the policy and procedures for which provides a healthy meal for every child without demeaning the student. On line 2.19, this requires the school board to affirm the model meals policy and inform parents of the school policy. We would suggest that posting on the website and in the student handbook would provide the transparency and the accountability needed. It is in which school districts have, places where school districts have not adopted the policy, the department could then reach out to these school districts with best practices from surrounding districts and around the state. And the department has come out with a guidance document, and they have collected best practices. And it is actually very encouraging to look at where some of the school districts are. Not that we don't have a long ways to go yet in some school districts, but some school districts have made great strides in this area already. On line 3.5 and following, this requires the MDE commissioner to develop a model policy. As mentioned, MSBA has a model policy which addresses the concerns that we share. We would like to note that the commissioner stated in guidance on this topic that school districts are in the best position to understand their school community's attitudes, beliefs, and cultural sensitivities on methods of reminding and collecting payments. What may work for one school district's community may not work for another. In summary, I would like to just leave you with 3 points. First, we believe that local school districts should determine their local policies. They are in the best position to understand their students and their communities. For the most part, since the 2014 law has passed that bans this type of behavior has worked. Unfortunately, one case has really poisoned the well. Local schools have responded in general with developing local policies and procedures that ensure that all students have the nutritious meals needed and are ready to learn. Second, restricting negative or providing negative consequences to those who have, we think that we should be restricting negative consequences to those who have engaged in the negative behavior, as opposed to all school districts. Third, every child needs a nutritious meal without embarrassment. Unfortunately, this does become a fiscal discussion. Perhaps it is time to fully fund lunch for all, as in Representative Thiessen's bill, House File 3073, or ask the state to reimburse school districts for their unpaid meal charges. And we feel like this may be what needs to happen next in order to solidify this agreement. We want to be part of the solution at MSBA. We will continue to work with the author to ensure that every student receives a healthy meal and retains their dignity. With that, Madam Chair, I'll conclude my comments.
Thank you, Ms. Dietrich. Mr. Uni, please say your name for the record to begin.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, again, my name is Adosh Uni. I'm the Director of Government Relations at the Department of Education. Thanks again for having the opportunity to provide some comments on this bill. We've been able to connect with Representative Jurgens on the bill broadly. We have an upcoming meeting with him and advocates to discuss further. As was mentioned, the department in the policy bill has come out with a lunch shaming provision, one of which that applies to collection agencies as well as the collection agencies that the districts use, as well as the districts laying out a non-exhaustive list of shaming techniques, as well as not allowing districts to prohibit participation in extracurricular activities should there be an outstanding lunch fee. We know the commissioner feels very strongly about fees, and this is one area that we've heard at least some instances where districts in some instances where districts have used unpaid lunch fees to prohibit participation in extracurricular activities, which we do believe is a stigmatizing practice. In terms of this bill, which again we look forward to working with Representative Jurgens on addressing some of our concerns, as well as some of the concerns of the advocates around our bill. I would just like to point out that the annual approval process may be a little bit high of a bar for districts. It may come off as a bit heavy-handed. Currently, the districts don't have to provide their policies every year. I think, as Ms. Dietrich mentioned, if they were to adhere to the proposal of a model policy, it's possible that the policy could be good for several years, and so we might want to reconsider the repetitiveness of one annual check on it, as well as the load that it would create at the department. I'm pretty sure that would create a demand for more hands on deck to be able to evaluate these policies in a timely manner and in a comprehensive manner. I'm fairly certain that policymakers and advocates would want to know just a little bit more than do they have a policy that checks the box. They'd probably want to know a little bit more about that. So we'd want to have staff to be able to provide that analysis, as well as be able to do outreach to those districts that have those policies that might not be up to snuff. So that would create, I think, a little bit more manpower at the department. And to also touch on the point that Ms. Dietrich brought up around recouping school lunch aid from districts that don't have policies, I don't know if the department necessarily agrees with the policy of the stick policy for districts that don't have an actual policy on hand that might create more of a dire financial situation for the districts and their ability to provide the best services for their students, having a zeroed out lunch account because they don't have a policy. We're obviously open to working and hearing around more enforcement mechanisms, but right now I don't believe that this is necessarily the route that we'd want to take. In building up a system that would be able to recoup the funding from districts that don't have a model policy, as well as distribute it out to districts that do have a shortfall in their accounts, would also take some manpower there. So we just want to be cognizant of the costs and the timelines that it would take to build out those systems. But all in all, outside of those concerns, I think we just want to say that we look forward to working on this. I know the commissioner took the accounts of school lunch shaming over the interim before that very seriously. One of the reasons, driving the reason behind us having a policy or a proposal in our policy bill. And so we look forward to working with Representative Jurgens and the advocates in MSBA and further policies.
Thank you, Mr. Oni. Are there questions for the testifiers? Thank you very much, testifiers. Representative Jurgens, closing comments.
Madam Chair, it's been a long day, so I will be very brief. I think you heard in the testimony those that testified that are generally in favor of the bill think that there could be some improvement made to it. Those who are generally not in favor of the bill are at least in agreement in the concept. So I think that shows that we do have some common ground, and we will continue to work on this so that we can get it right.
Thank you, Representative Jurgens. The chair lays over House File 2724 for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill. Thank you,
Madam
Representative
Chair.
Jurgens. Representative Gruenhagen. The chair moves House File 2825. Representative Gruenhagen, welcome to the committee. I believe you have a DE1 amendment to get the bill in the shape you want.
Yes, Madam Chair.
The chair will move the DE1 amendment. Members, what this amendment does is add a paragraph of clarification, paragraph B. Actually, I think what we've done is, Ms. Para, is it correct that we just rewrote the language so that it was more easily understood, Ms. Para?
Madam Chair, that's correct.
So actually, the amendment is a clarification of a previous amendment. Is there any discussion on the DE1 amendment to House File 2825? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails, and the DE1 amendment is adopted. Representative Gruen explained this proposal that authorizes certain non-public students to participate in career technical courses through PSEO.
Thank you, Chair Erickson and committee for hearing this bill. This bill comes to me from a constituent in my district, and her daughter was in the 10th grade. She was a part-time public school student, and she completed all the requirements to be able to help at a local nursing home, the Good Samaritan Home in Winthrop, Minnesota. But because she wasn't a full-time public school student, she wasn't, even though she had completed all the requirements, she was not able to be employed at the local nursing home, which, by the way, in the rural area, it's a very critical need to have help in the nursing homes. And I'm sure in the metro it's very similar, but in the rural it is at a crisis point in many cases. So there, you know, if she was a 10th grade full-time public school student, she would have been able to work at the local nursing home. But because she was simply part-time, and this particular bill, if you're private, parochial, homeschool, even though you complete all the requirements, you can't work at the local nursing home. So what this bill does is, it gives those students, alternative pupil students, the same opportunity as a full-time public school student to work at the local nursing home, as long as they meet all the requirements. It's just, to me, it's a technical bill, and it's a matter of leveling the playing field on the, for the opportunities of the 10th grader. By the way, in the 11th and 12th grade, there we don't have this problem. There, whether you're a part-time public school student, whether you're parochial or private or homeschool, as long as you complete the requirements, you can work at your local nursing home. It's just at the 10th grade level, it's a full-time public school student only, and the other students are excluded. I think it probably was an oversight when the bill was drafted to allow 10th graders in there, and hopefully this will correct that.
Thank you, Representative Gruenhagen. Actually, the bill was mine and former Senator Olson's for allowing 10th graders to participate in.
And Madam Chair, I'm glad I didn't criticize too much then.
It wasn't an oversight. I think that was just, what we could get through at that time. So that's the way it stands.
I completely agree with your assessment,
Are there
Madam Chair.
questions for the author? Representative Pryor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it also includes post-secondary education option students in 10th grade that are in these alternative programs as you described them. So, and is that true now, like you said, for the CTE students, that it's 11th and 12th grade that can go and
Yes, that's my
and
understanding.
for the PSEO too? Thank you.
Madam
Representative
Chair?
Gruenhagen.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Representative Pryor, yes, that is my understanding.
Okay.
I had a testifier, but she had a family semi-emergency, and she had to leave, so she wasn't able to be here to testify. I apologize for that.
And may I
Well,
ask-
members, if you check paragraph B, a 10th grade student qualifies as an alternative pupil if the student is enrolled in a career technical education course offered by an eligible institution, and this was the one that Senator Olson and I focused on, received a passing score on the 8th grade Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment or another reading assessment accepted by the enrolling post-secondary institution. A career or technical education course must meet the requirements under 5A, and that's what you have above. If an alternative pupil in 10th grade receives a grade of C or better in the career or technical education course taken under this subdivision, the post-secondary institution must allow the student to take additional post-secondary courses for credit at the institution, not to exceed the limits in subdivision 8. So that is primarily what the bill was back in 2011. But now we're adding the 10th grade student from the non-public. And they call them alternative pupils.
Madam Chair, may I ask, will this go to the Higher Education Committee too, and would there be a fiscal note for including
That's a
that
good
group of
question,
students?
Representative Pryor. We asked them if they'd like to see it, and they said no. Higher Ed? Oh, are we sending this to Higher Ed? I think maybe we'll be checking with them. It's not going to finance, but I thought it was, I'm sorry. Yes, we're laying it over, so we'll check with them and we'll bring it up again if they want to see it. But that's probably a good question. I don't believe that this bill went to higher ed in 11, but I might be mistaken. But thank you for the question. Any other questions for Representative Gruenhagen? Okay, with no questions, the chair lays over 2825 as amended for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Gruenhagen. Representative Lucero, this is our last bill of the evening. Members, this is our student data privacy proposal that's returning to us after we heard a longer version a few years ago. Welcome, Representative Lucero. The chair will move House File first engrossment. Yes. I'm moving the first engrossment of 1507, and I believe you have an author's amendment that I will move as well. The chair moves H1507A2. Representative Lucero, will you introduce yourself and then tell us about this amendment that we're attaching before we walk through your bill?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity. The amendment is one that this has been a work in progress. I've been working on this for 4 years. You made a reference to last year, and it was re-referred from this committee, originally assigned to this committee, over to civil law, and it's coming back now. But I've been working on this for longer than that, and it is many stakeholders to get their input on how we can improve this bill to the best degree possible. And so this amendment incorporates several additional changes that have been made since the civil law. I presented this amendment in Civil Law Committee as well, but I wasn't able to get it submitted by the deadline.
Thank you, Representative Lucero. Is there any discussion to the A2 amendment? Hearing none and seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. Okay, Representative Lucero has placed data privacy for education in Chapter 13 for all of you who are listening or sitting in the audience, which is, a different approach. So we are curious about what you have here, although you and I have spoken many times. So please proceed to explain 1507 as amended.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to go over some of the background. So my own background personally, what I do for a living is cybersecurity. And so one of the things that I took on here upon being first elected in 2014, starting my first term in 2015, is to take on this topic. Now, the topic of data security, information protection and privacy is agnostic to the application. First name, last name, social security number, street address, birth date, and many additional pieces of information are important to be protected regardless of the context by which they're being used. Now, so there are many things that we need to do in Minnesota law to get the law caught up to where technology is, because the technology is continuously advancing and innovating with new capabilities. So we can't boil the ocean, but what I did was to take the approach of let's start with K through 12. That's what I did. When I had the privilege of being a member of the Education Innovation Policy Committee in my first term, one of the things that I did was to make a presentation on information security and that topic. And I know that there are several members on this committee that were not here at the time to see that presentation, but I won't give it again because that presentation by itself was about 20 minutes. But it just gave some of the foundation of why information and cybersecurity is important. In the interim, some of the work that we've been doing over this past summer, in addition to meeting with many different stakeholders to get their feedback, was we had an informational hearing in the Legislative Commission on data practices and personal data privacy on this effort. Recently, then the most recent committee was in Civil Law, as I mentioned before, and just prior, I think it was the day or two prior to being heard in Civil Law Committee, CARE 11 actually did a segment on the topic of student data privacy. And the segment itself was about 4 to 5 minutes, and it was a very informative segment, compacted a lot of information in a short period of time, but it highlighted the importance of this topic and why parents are increasingly becoming cognizant of the need to have protection. The objective of the bill is to protect student data privacy and ensure parental authority over their children's private data. And as Madam Chair, as you mentioned, the initial approach was to write it into Chapter 125B, but we rewrote it into Chapter 13. And the reason we did that was what we wanted to do, and part of the objective is to try to take advantage of as much current law as possible. By rewriting it into Chapter 13, which obviously focuses on data itself, that allowed us to better do that with cross-references, so we don't need to create new law where new law isn't necessarily needed. So walking through the bill, I'll just do it briefly here. There has been an update to educational data. So educational data was an existing definition, and we made an update to that. There wasn't, for this purposes, we defined what a parent is, and parent is parent or guardian of somebody who has legal custody over somebody who's under 18. New definition for what a school-issued device is. A new definition on line 2.19 there of a technology provider. Then beginning in section 2, subdivision 13, that defines, it requires the school district to form a security policy. What a security policy is, it is one of the first things that is to be done documenting requirements. A security policy is not specific to any type of department or private sector, public sector. A security policy is very agnostic to the data, and I just have an example here of what a policy can look like. Because policies and security standards and procedures are commonly used across the industry, not just education, but in the industry of cybersecurity, there are many available at the fingertips. NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, SANS organization has many resources available to help draft security policies. But a security policy is important because it is the first step to document what requirements are in order to know how to protect data. Also in this section then, there's a requirement for an audit trail. We have seen many, many headlines of data breaches. What an audit trail allows is it creates a log of events that occur when it comes to people or staff or authorized parties viewing or interacting with the data. So one of the requirements I have is to have an audit trail that includes 4 elements. When data is accessed, it requires who performs the action, the recipient of the action, so which student's account, for example, is the one being touched. So who performed the action, the recipient of the action, what action was performed, was it reading the data, was it deleting the data, modifying the data, creating data, and then what was the date time stamp that the action occurred. Those 4 elements are critically important because when there's a breach, being able to go back and see who was impacted is important. And in the absence of an audit trail, that question cannot be answered. And in fact, one of the example policies that I printed off here, and I'll just read, this right here is the information logging standard. It's a template that can be used to help create a policy. And in the overview, as it reads here, logging from critical systems, applications, and services can provide key information and potential indicators of compromise. The purpose of this document attempts to address the issue by identifying specific requirements that information systems must meet in order to generate appropriate audit logs. So again, when there's a compromise or a potential indicator of a compromise, that is why an audit trail is important. And in these breaches that you may have heard, you want to know, I can imagine one of the first things that runs through your mind is, was my data impacted? And am I now going to be subject to potential identity theft? Well, the only way to know who was impacted, again, I'm stressing, is the existence of an audit trail. And I would suspect that many districts are already performing an audit trail on their technology systems, but this just makes sure that it's uniform across the board so that we don't have an example of a potential breach or compromise of data and then a district unable to be able to answer, was my student's data compromised? Going through, because technology systems may still be in use that were implemented 10 or 20 years ago, I have a grandfather exception. If an audit trail isn't capable in an existing technology system, I'm allowing for that to, as an exception. So it would be new technology systems after the enactment date that would be required to have an audit trail. And that is not an insurmountable burden because most technology vendors, if they are in an enterprise market, they are building this functionality. In fact, it's been a long time since I've come across an application or a piece of hardware that doesn't have this functionality. Subdivision 14, training is required. We can't take for granted that people know best practices of how to handle data and do so in a secure manner. So what this is requiring is that when it comes to FERPA and other existing state requirements, that this is simply saying that the school district is required to ensure that their staff that has access to student private data is familiar with the requirements of FERPA and other state statutes relating to ensuring protection of data. Getting to subdivision 15, when it comes to technology providers now, a technology provider is a vendor that might be providing either software or hardware to an educational institution. And so their requirements, beginning on line 4.1, that the data is the property of the school. It's not the property of the technology vendor. The next lines here, 4.4 through 4.7, they cross-reference existing statute 13.055. Those are breach notification requirements. So if a technology vendor who has the fiduciary responsibility and has student private information in their technology systems, if they suffer a compromise, that the technology vendor is subject to existing breach notification requirements. Lines 4.8 through 4.11, that upon the natural expiration of a contract that a school district might have with the technology vendor, that at the expiration of that contract, that because the data doesn't belong to the technology vendor, it has to be returned to the school district or destroyed. 4.12 through 16, limits on the use of data. A technology provider cannot sell, share, or disseminate educational data except for instances such as obligations. Let's just, for example, if there was an acquisition that occurred from one technology provider purchasing or merging with another, just as an example. So there's exceptions that can happen.
Excuse me, Representative Lucero, but members, if you're trying to follow this, you have to go to the unengrossed copy that you have in your files. So if you discover that, then you're saved. I'm sorry, I was going to announce that to begin with, that he was going to follow that instead of what I moved. So to follow along, we're with you now, Representative Lucero. I've been going back and forth checking. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When it comes, line 4.7 and 4.17 and 1.8, no marketing of the data technology provider cannot use educational data for commercial purposes, such as including but not limited to marketing or advertising to a student. Then starting in line 4.19 through 4.30, that is very similar language to subdivision 13, whereas subdivision 13 required school districts to have a security policy, which again is just the fundamental foundation of any security program. Security policy and then an audit trail. This is language that would apply to the technology vendor. Similarly, they have to have a security policy in existence and an audit trail for their technology systems. Beginning in line 5.1, this is contracts. So technology vendors, could be hardware, software, that are going to be supplied to a school district. Obviously, in the vast majority of cases, the school district has contracted with that technology provider, and there's a contract in existence. What this is requiring is that the educational institution give on an annual basis, within 30 days of the start of the school year, parents direct timely notice by mail, email, or other direct form of communication, the contract, and then in regards to educational data, the technology vendor, the educational data impacted, and then information about the contract to be able to inspect it. And if an opt-out exists that was negotiated and is contained within the contract, that that parent is aware of that opt-out. So I've had confusion on this. Several stakeholders have come up. This does not expand in any way existing opt-out authority. This is simply saying that if the school district, in negotiations with the technology provider, included, for whatever reason that those negotiating parties so chose, an opt-out provision in that contract, that parents are aware of that opt-out authority, that the parents have the right to exercise. That's all that opt-out does. Start 5.10 and 5.11, so there are some school districts that are very proactive, and they are allowing their parents to be able to have access to the contracts that are negotiated, but there are other school districts that I've heard or been made aware of that are not necessarily as open and making contracts readily available to parents. This is just simply saying that the contracts have to be available to parents to inspect. That's how we ensure accountability. When things are out in the open, we can ensure that parents are empowered with knowledge and then their rights. Starting in line 5.12 through 5.15, that if a parent so chose to exercise an opt-out that the school district negotiated, that they're not penalized, the child is not penalized for that opt-out being exercised. Starting in subdivision 16, when it comes to school-issued devices now, that if the school-issued device contains the ability to have a location tracking, audio, microphone, visual, which would be a camera, capabilities, that the school district is not permitted to remotely enable those or monitor the keystroke or the web browsing unless, and there's several exceptions, so they can't do those things unless the student to whom the school-issued device initiates or agrees to the activity, right? So this would not create a prohibition from a piece of technology or a school-issued device from being used in an academic setting, because obviously the student is aware that and/or initiated the connection. Unless that remote enabling of the GPS or remote enabling of a webcam is part of a judicial process, so legal process, unless enabling those abilities in order to recover a lost or stolen device. So if the device has been reported lost or stolen, they can attempt to turn on GPS or web tracking. Unless there's a threat to life or a safety. If there's a threat to life or safety and enabling a webcam is going to help protect that, we obviously want to allow that. Or to enforce an acceptable use policy. We don't want school districts to be prevented from enforcing acceptable use policies such as web browsing activity to inappropriate sites. So those are all clearly still allowed. And then if any of the above is exercised as the exceptions, that the school district is required within 72 hours to give notice to the parents articulating why. So for example, let's say the cam was initiated remotely due to a threat to life or safety, that explanation be articulated, that incident that they did indeed remotely enable that feature, and then it's simply telling the parents and then why that was enabled for threat or life of safety or safety. Starting in subdivision 17, this applies to E through 12 public and private schools, not home schools. It does not apply to post-secondary. Didn't want to go there. This is strictly in scope through E through 12. And then that's it, Madam Chair. And with that, I've lost 3 of my testifiers due to time, so I know one has to leave here like in minutes, so I will let Chris testify with your permission, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Lucero, for your presentation. And yes, we'll call on testifiers now. So please say your name for the record and begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Chris Daniels. I have in here good morning, but it's actually evening, right? So good evening, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for considering HF 1507 and allowing us to testify. My name is Chris Daniels, and I'm a father of 2 school-aged children. As a board member of MAC, I'm part of an unpaid grassroots team that has been working for 4 years and thousands of hours on education issues. One of MAC's main goals since our inception has been trying to protect the data of all Minnesota's children in a rapidly evolving technology landscape that we find ourselves in today. A few key aspects addressed in this bill will provide additional layers of protection that are currently not afforded our children. And this is important because most parents are unaware to the extent of the data being collected and stored on their children. Even if they are aware, there's a certain unspoken trust that parents have with the schools they send their children. Most probably assume that there is far less data collected than there is, and they assume that there are protections in place for that data. We are all too familiar with the challenges we face as a society in regard to protection of PII, personally identifiable information, in simple day-to-day operations. From credit bureaus to Target, the safety of our privacy is constantly under attack. However, if Target had said they wouldn't change anything or that they simply would ignore the data breach, would customers respond positively? Without any new laws addressing the major technology changes that have taken place in education, it puts our children's privacy, identity, and financial futures at risk. School contracts with third parties who have access to our children's data and ensuring best practices of handling the data are essential. The issue of data sharing issues that the contract should address is ensuring that any third parties who view or use our children's data are not selling or sharing the data in a blind spot to the parents or the schools. In this bill, subdivision 15, line 4.2 directly addresses third parties, forbidding them from selling, sharing, or disseminating our children's personally identifiable information. Our children's data should never be fodder for profit. This bill is an important aspect in addressing privacy issues that the new frontier of technology and education has exposed. On behalf of all Minnesota children, I ask for your support on HF 1507. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels. Welcome. Say your name for the record and begin.
My name is Kirsten Schultz. Good evening, Madam Chair and committee members. We as MAC have been working for the last 4 years with stakeholders on HF 1507 to provide necessary protection for our children. The U.S. Department of Education established the Privacy Technical Assistance Center, PTAC, as a one-stop resource for education stakeholders. In a recent finding letter, PTAC states, most importantly, the key stakeholders protected here are the parents and the students themselves. FERPA was written to provide express controls for parents over their children's education record, and this letter shows while the technology may change, the underlying right is sound and strong. According to FERPA, it is the school's responsibility to provide these protections through its contracts it signs with third parties. The school must maintain direct control over use of FERPA-protected student information. Protected student information, or PII, is defined to include direct identifiers and indirect identifiers, including metadata and even aggregate information, if it can be put together with public or other data to identify a student. In a recent finding letter, it says that there are some ed tech services required by schools which offered directly to students, and so it is common practice for parents or eligible students to be directed to download, sign up for, or otherwise enroll in a particular platform, educational product, or online service without the school operating as the intermediary. That requires them to agree to a term of service or a click-wrap agreement. That may not align with FERPA's requirements. This letter makes clear that even when the school doesn't directly own or manage the student account, the schools must take responsibility to ensure any mandatory ed tech product is used only in compliance with FERPA protections. A parent cannot be directed to consent to an account for their child with insufficient privacy or terms of service as a workaround to standards required if a school was directly contracting with the provider. This responsibility is one of the reasons HF 1507 speaks on teacher and staff training in subdivision 14, as they could be the ones exposing the student or parents to these terms of service. PTAC also states that the school and providers should post contracts to promote transparency. These contracts should be posted in a manner easy for parents to find and should include a list of data elements shared with the provider and an explanation of how they are used. HF 1507 speaks on this in subdivision 15. We in Minnesota need to make the move to ensure the privacy of our children is protected. We need to act to assure the federal FERPA laws are being followed by passing our own state statutes. Many of the providers have signed a student privacy pledge and therefore pledged to follow the same rules proposed in HF 1507. Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members, for your considered support of HF 1507.
Thank you very much, Ms. Schultz, for being so succinct. Welcome. Say your name for the record and begin.
Becky Lannis. Madam Chair and committee members, good evening. Thank you for hearing my testimony. My name again is Becky Lannis. I have 3 children and want to speak in support of HF 1507. As a parent, I am very concerned about data privacy for my children. In the October hearing of the Data Practices Commission, a school IT director testified that schools generally work with 35 to 45 contracts annually, and that the acceptance of third-party model contract language without negotiation is likely occurring in some districts. And so one of the most important subdivisions of this legislation is the contract between the school and the third party. I want to reference the article by the U.S. Department of Ed finding, mentioning that schools cannot require parents or students to waive their FERPA rights through ed tech companies' term of a service. Because this is a finding or interpretation of the FERPA law and has great similarities to our bill in regards to third-party contracts, I'm going to mention this article. In January 2018, the U.S. Department of Education document and their findings concerning ed tech company K-12 Inc. was the first to be issued a USAID agency finding letter in 2012 due to their policies and practices in violation of FERPA. This is referred to as the Agora letter, published in November 2017, that serves as a finding or interpretation of FERPA. Agora Charter had contracted with educational company K-12 Inc., whose terms of service stated this: by posting or submitting member content to this site, you grant K-12 and its affiliates and licensees the right to use, reproduce, display, perform, adapt, modify, distribute, have distributed, and promote the content in any form. K-12 Inc. provides schools in Minnesota with online education services such as Insight School of Minnesota, an MDE-approved online vendor. According to USAID, U.S. Department of Education, the terms of use allowed near universal use and distribution by K-12 and various third-party affiliates and licensees of information that could have constituted her child's personal identifiable information from education records, an outcome that constituted an unlawful forfeiture of the parent's rights under FERPA to protect against unauthorized disclosure of personal identifiable information from her child's education records. Additionally, the U.S. Department of Education stated, requiring the parent to accept the K-12 Inc. terms of use when she signed up her child for the school constituted a forced waiver of parental rights under FERPA. And so the finding, a parent or eligible student cannot be required to waive the rights and protections accorded under FERPA as a condition of acceptance into an educational institution. And a parent or eligible student cannot be required to waive the right and protections under FERPA as a condition of receipt of educational training or services. In the case of Agora, the parent's rights were waived when the parent refused to accept the terms of service. In that case, the parent was able to view the contract. However, across Minnesota, parents are not given due notice of third-party contracts, nor have they viewed the contracts. I am aware of parents who have requested a third-party contract from their school district, only to find they must file a FOIA. Some of the reasons I support HF 1507, it includes direct and timely notice to parents of technology providers working with student ed data. Parents will be notified of identifying each technology provider with data to ed data, identifying the ed data affected by the technology provider contract, information about how to inspect the contract. Institutions must provide parents and students the opportunity to inspect a complete copy of any contract with a technology provider. An important opt-out for any parent whose school has entered into a third-party contract in violation of FERPA. And lastly, language stating that technology providers must not sell, share, or disseminate educational data. I highly encourage you to vote in favor of HF 1507. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lannis. Are there questions for the testifiers, or do we have other testifiers? Mr. Heller, and just a minute. Now, before you two begin, are you testifying with concerns yet, or in support? And Mr. Heller doesn't know for sure. Okay, Mr. Heller, you sit down and we'll listen to you shortly. Introduce yourself for the record, please, and begin.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Ben Feist. I'm the Legislative Director for the ACLU of Minnesota. I will be brief since it's been a very long day for everyone. But this is an issue that the ACLU has been focused on for several years. We've heard about all the good work that's been done. When this bill was first before you, I believe it was 16 pages a few years ago. And so after listening to all the stakeholders and figuring out what type of bite-sized pieces we could really deal with now, you see the bill before you. I think that it's a good compromise from the ACLU perspective. We would certainly like to see more in this bill, but we are cognizant of the fact that we have to get things passed and that there are a lot of stakeholders here. So I do want to thank Representative Lucero for all of his work on this and the other advocates as well. The ACLU has really focused on the particular technologies at issue here that we're most concerned about. The fact that student data used to be kept in pieces of paper in the principal's office in a locked filing cabinet. Now it's off somewhere in the cloud, and we have third parties who are involved in that process. So this bill is trying to get at that new technological change and seeing that we really need to move into the 21st century with student data. Similarly, it touches on the issue of the one-to-one devices such as iPads or laptops that are taken home by students, and the importance of making sure that we have some safeguards in place so that the information on those, including the location of the device, the webcam, and so on, is not being used inappropriately. But with that, we do support this bill, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Feist. So if you would just stay there. Mr. Heller, welcome to the committee. Please say your name for the record and begin.
Rick Heller, unofficially represent the twice exceptional apprentice. They will come to testify on House File 1507. I was one of those individuals that did not have access and even knew about FERPA for many years. And if I understand this bill correctly, you have to opt out of the activity with the private providers. Is that correct?
Mr. Lucero.
If the school district negotiated with the technology provider an opt-out provision that would exist in the contract, then parents would have the right to opt out, to exercise that. If an opt-out doesn't exist in the contract, this doesn't expand any other opt-out or opt-in provisions.
Mr. Heller.
So basically, if I understand it correctly, then it means that if the contract says that, you have to agree to it to have access to their database. Is that correct?
Representative Lucero.
No, if I understand your question correctly. If the school district did not include an opt-out in their contract, then no authorization would be needed. If an opt-out does exist, a parent could voluntarily elect, they don't have to, but they could elect to opt out to whatever the contract specifies.
Mr. Heller.
So if it's don't ask, don't tell, nobody will ever know then, if that's the way I understand that. Either way, contracts explicitly says you have to ask them. I'm a firm believer you need to ask the parents, frankly, to opt in, not opt out, because once you're opted in, discussion's over, unless you know about it. That's my view on it. The other one on page 3.1 of the UE1.
The unofficial engrossment.
He talked about security safeguards, audit. It's my belief, I know the State Department's here and they'll be willing to yield to a question, but since there's currently three state agencies that are school districts and state agencies, And I'd like to know how this applies with what they're currently doing as it relates to 508 refresh, accessibility law. The other one is, I spoke at the Data Practice Commission about terms and conditions and how complex they are. It's my understanding, to the chair, the question is, Minnesota has set the text difficulty for every student in every grade, and has decided for the audience what level, the reading level special education form they're going to be. About 2 years ago, they passed a law about requiring the State Department to set the text difficulty and find out what metric that was going to be. So the question really is, based on plain language law, for parents to understand this information, how relevant is that to the terms and conditions when school districts, only 3 have to apply 508, when other school districts only apply 504?
Mr. Heller, maybe the department will address that when they come forward.
And then the other piece of this is FERPA is silent on what electronic means, and it's outdated. And today, it's 508 refresh. And we start talking about technology and electronic, and the data practice law does not get into that. However, it does for state agencies, because they, which are 3 school districts, the blind, the deaf, and the perpetual center, they have to apply this. So just a piece to consider again on those 3 or 4 elements as we move ahead with the handhelds. The other thing I found out is that the school districts are monitoring students' activities in the school, and I don't believe they know that. If they want to come up and talk about that, they're welcome to, because they like to know what kind of things are being said in the schools with their personal devices, so they can see, you know, what's going on that might, they could shut something down, not to have a red code. So that's just, you know, something that I think needs to be a constructive conversation as we start keeping the school districts off of their personal devices versus their school devices. I think that's a relevant discussion in the future you might want to have with that as well. Because again, we want to know what kids are doing. It's personal, private. However, we all know that kids can even get expelled for off school using personal devices or even their own school devices. And school districts do monitor what kids access. I was one of those parents that found that out. And they lost their device. And they didn't have the protection, the security protections on the computer for the internet.
Mr. Heller, how many years ago was that? Mr. Heller, how many years ago was that you experienced this as a parent?
Oh, about 4 years.
Any questions for Mr. Heller or for Mr. Feist? Thank you, both of you. Are there others who would like to come forward with support? Please. Please say your name for the record and begin.
My name is Michelle Kenny. I'm an attorney with Knutson, Flynn, and Deans, and I'm here representing the Minnesota School Boards Association. And thank you, Madam Chair and committee members, for allowing me to speak to you tonight. In general, the MSBA supports the amended bill that is before you. However, we would like to see or comment on a few technical clarifications that we think would be important to implementing the bill as amended. The first area is the new definition of parent, which is included at line 2.7.
Yes.
And since this bill is provided for inclusion in 13.32, which is part of the Data Practices Act, we believe it would be important for the definition to be consistent with the Data Practices Act as well as with FERPA, which is the federal law addressing data privacy of students. Now, under the Data Practices Act, Section 13.02, Subdivision 8, defines individual. It doesn't define parent, but does specifically say that an individual includes a parent or guardian, or an individual acting as a parent or guardian in the absence of a parent or guardian. That's pretty consistent with the definition of parent under FERPA, which is a parent of a student and includes a natural parent, a guardian, or an individual acting as a parent in the absence of a parent or guardian. So our suggestion would be to have that definition of parent be consistent with those other parts of the law. With respect to subdivision 13, which is found on line 2.28, that provides for, it indicates a public agency or institution must establish written procedures to ensure appropriate security safeguards for educational data stored on an electronic database. Being a very close reader of legislation, the use of the word "and" to me suggests that that would include not only an electronic database that the school district has itself, but would also include an electronic database that's created by another technology provider. And I think that this is already addressed elsewhere in the statute, in subdivision 15G at line 4.10. So I think that just simply focusing subdivision 13 to the school district's electronic database would be a little more clear.
Would you repeat the line that you were referring to originally?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the one before the amendment, so. So this is what I'm looking at here. But is it "and"? So I'm looking at line 3.2.
Yes.
And it starts out limited to an
Yes.
electronic database. So
Yes.
it's the "and," which we would suggest maybe be considered to be the school district's electronic database, et cetera, or its electronic database, et cetera, just to make it more clear that we're talking only about the school districts at that point in time. And then as we look forward in 15G, line 4.10 is what I have.
That's line 4.1. Let's see.
It's the technology providers information.
My head is different. 418? Yes.
So it's something regarding the audit trail for the technology product audit trail. Over here. So. I apologize, Madam Chair.
No, I sympathize with you. I'm having the same struggle.
Well, I think that it is taken care of in the technology provider part of it, and I think, maybe just looking at that.
Representative Lucero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Part of the complication here is the notes that are written were for the pre-amendment version. So this would be, what we have in front of us is the new amendment, or obviously the post-amendment. But I could say would love to sit down, and if there's any concerns with the newly adopted language, I definitely am very receptive to incorporating, as I've been doing now for several years. So that might be more productive than
I think you're
trying
right.
to find it, so.
I would agree.
Thank you, Representative Lucero. I think that's wisely said.
So moving on to the audit trail piece, the School Boards Association was initially concerned about the audit trail, but with the amendment feels a lot more comfortable now that we can rely on an audit trail that is automatically created within the system. The one part that MSBA still has reservations about is the annual training.
Yes.
Because this involves all individuals who have access to the data. And this is quite widespread throughout the district, whether it be an administrator, a teacher, a school nurse, a school counselor, et cetera. And providing the training would be very expensive. And so something to just possibly consider is that it not have to be on an annual basis, but maybe every few years, or some other cycle rather than annually. Certainly, the districts want their people to know and understand their responsibilities under the Data Practices Act, but this does create a financial burden on school districts. And then the other piece is there's, with respect to opting out from the, if the contract provides for an opt-out provision, we would just recommend that it potentially be in writing. That would just provide an administrative way for the school district to follow those opt-outs. And then another area of maybe some clarification being needed with respect to if a student does opt out, that there not be a penalty for or withholding of an educational benefit. And the concern related to that is sometimes these technology solutions take the student data and they're able to provide information such as what colleges the student would be able to be accepted at, or scholarship information. And while school districts certainly would be on board with helping students get that information otherwise, I guess understanding what the level is of withholding an educational benefit would be helpful. And then I think that's it. The School Boards Association would also indicate that it's appreciative of the amendment to the area where a one-on-one device could be looked at or searched, so to say, for the keyboard strokes when it's necessary to enforce the acceptable use policy. So with that, Madam Chair, I complete my comments.
So Ms. Kenny, I have a question for you on the audit trail requirement. Do you think this proposal is clear in why these logs need to be maintained and how they're going to provide a safeguard in the privacy area? Do you think that's clear in this proposal?
Well, I think that
So a person in line 3.4, a person may access the educational data only if authorized. A person may be authorized to access educational data only if access is necessary. But do you think that answers the questions about, I mean, is this going to protect data any better?
Well, I think this is consistent with the Data Practices Act now. I mean, if you don't have authorization, number one, you should not be accessing the data. And there is a provision for when an individual has a legitimate work interest in the data, that they may access it. And so I think those are consistent with current law.
How about storing these logs?
Well, the logs, storage of the logs would need to be consistent with the school district's records retention schedule. I think that a lot of them are in the system, so to say. So when they are printed out, or that they would need to be, retained consistent with the records retention schedule. I don't know offhand what that period of time would be right at this moment.
So Ms. Kenny, that also would have to do with deletion of any of those, according to the retention schedule?
Yes, if it was consistent with the retention schedule, then it could be deleted without additional authorization.
Thank you. Representative Lucero, comments? Or, well, while you're studying, we'll hear from Mr. Arnson.
Madam Chair, Roger Arnson with the Elementary and Secondary Principals Association. I appreciate the opportunity just to weigh in on a couple of small things we want you to think about here. And by the way, I'm happy to say I have avoided learning anything about technology providers and those provisions of the bill. But I'd like to direct your attention to Section 5 in the school-issued devices section. This talks about when school officials can access, or look at a school-issued device. And the bill says you don't want us to use the location tracking pieces or audio-visual pieces. But think about this. There are some exceptions, and one of them is in number 4, which is at line 5.24, that it's necessary to respond to an imminent threat of life or safety, and the access is limited to that purpose. We have the ability now, I mean, it's an astonishing deal, but when students have a school-issued device and they issue a website, for example, that says, how do you commit suicide? The principals actually get an email that says the student has accessed a site that you should be concerned about and that you should be calling the parent about. That may not necessarily be response to an imminent threat to life or safety. And I would suggest, and we'll visit with Representative Lucero about this, but we should say that the activity is necessary, I think, to protect the health and safety of the student. That's a little lower standard, and maybe you don't want us doing that. I'll tell you where the question has come up, Madam Chair. As principals have said to me, when we get that notice on Saturday, what's our obligation? And we say it's our obligation to try to contact the parent. It's a startling event in that particular sense, and I know we're concerned about suicide and the mental health pieces as well, and there are probably other examples as well. But I think that might be a good switch there from responding to the imminent threat of life or safety, because I'm not sure that is, and we'd actually like to be sure about the standard. The other piece, yes, go ahead, yeah.
Representative Lucero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just for purposes of clarity, he referenced for that line 5.24 in the in the post amendment. It's
we
lines.
found it.
Okay, good deal. So what I would add to those remarks though is line 6.6 and 6.67. An additional exception is to enforce an acceptable use policy, and I would venture to say that most school districts would include the scenario that was just referenced as part of monitoring web activity to enforce a school's acceptable use policy. So that scenario would be included in the language as already adopted.
Probably doesn't hurt to reinforce it, though. Mr. Arnson.
Madam Chair, I had one other comment, and actually it was relative to the section that Representative Lucero pointed to there. And I wonder, when we talk about is necessary to enforce the policy, there's a component of that is retrospective, and that maybe that language should be more active to say, to investigate compliance with the acceptable use policy. I've worked with Ms. Kinney a lot on these things too, and I think that would be a little more of where you want us to be on that is to investigate compliance with the policy. Just so you know, I think, and this is a different version of this, but the problem that we have is that kids do some bad things on these devices from time to time, and administrators get involved in interventions on them. And that really isn't an attempt to invade their privacy. So we think these standards work real well. We can make that work. So, okay, Madam Chair, appreciate it very much. Your accommodation is late hour. And we'll just
Further questions for the author?
So,
Others who maybe want to hear, go ahead.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to address a couple things in regards to training. So FERPA is obviously a national law, and when it comes to the information security industry, we don't like to reinvent the wheel. And so information security is information security regardless of the context. So in training on information security best practices, and the foundation of that being the formation or drafting, documenting an information security policy, we like to share and make available the efforts and work that others have done. So this is just one example. So when it comes to FERPA training, or training in general, given that FERPA in this example is a nationwide requirement, it's applying to all 50 states, there is training that's already been created. So helping teachers to utilize existing training modules would significantly reduce the cost. But I'm very receptive to potentially, having a conversation, maybe we change it to every other year, maybe. But then for new hires to have that happen, as part of whenever they're hired. But I'm receptive to that conversation. So, thank you, Madam Chair.
And I'm going to re-refer this to finance so that we find out what the costs are. Welcome to the testifying table. Please say your name for the record and begin.
Good evening, Madam Chair. My name is Tony Quillis, and I represent CompTIA, which is the Computing Technology Industry Association. It is a national trade association with over 100,000 members. And we specialize in professional certification programs for the IT industry, of which the gentleman sitting next to me is one of our certification professionals, as well as representing our members' interests throughout the United States. I'd like to thank Representative Lucero. He is, like you said, I've been working with him for probably a little bit over a year. He's been working on it for 4 years and has had an open door policy, Madam Chair, and has been, as you've seen this evening, very receptive to comments and changes that have gone through. So I wanted to thank him for that. But Madam Chair, as you've heard today, this evening also, and I don't have to tell you or the committee members, when I went to school, it dealt with a textbook and a chalkboard. And now education involves, laptops, computers, websites, apps, as well as a variety of stakeholders, as you've seen here this evening, the industry which I represent, parents, the students themselves, school boards, ACLU, and the Department of Education. So you've got this evolving technology as well as a wide variety of stakeholders in trying to bring them together on agreement of how to do this. Has been tough. But I'd like to stress that student data privacy is a top priority for the technology industry. We've been trying to provide flexibility for school boards and the Department of Education, yet still allow students to participate in these educational technology programs. Madam Chair, I wanted to make you aware of in 2014, there was something called the Service Provider Pledge to Safeguard Student Data Privacy. And over 300 of our members that work in coordination with school boards to provide educational technology have signed this pledge. And you've probably have heard a number of this before, but there's 6 bullet points to it. And the industry has pledged to totally ban the sale or rental of student data, ban targeted advertising to students based on educational services, ban building a profile of students for any purpose other than educational purposes, sharply limit disclosures of student information obtained by educational tech providers, require educational tech providers to maintain reasonable security practices and protect student data, and then finally require deletion of student data whenever a school or school district requests that data be deleted. So there are the same shared goals that Representative Lucero and the technology industry have. We're trying to get there. There have been 20-plus other states that have done this, that have threaded this needle, and we're trying to do it here in Minnesota, and I just wanted to point that out. And finally, Madam Chair, I think the key is to allow these technology solutions to be used in educating our students today. With that, I just want to thank you for your time. I'm hoping I'm the last speaker, and I know better than to be between you and dinner. So, stand for any questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Qualls? We appreciate your testimony. Thank you very much. Are there others in the audience who would like to speak? Now or forever hold your peace? Mr. Uni? No. I know, you're not wading into this. This is too deep. Representative Mariani,
Madam Chair,
you're going to wade.
I just want to commend Representative Lucero for not only the hard work, but the way you've approached this. I think it's an exemplary example of good legislating. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative Mariani. I know how hard he's worked too, how many times he's met with me, and I've just went, oh, not sure. Any other questions from members? Closing comments, Representative Lucero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just briefly, as was mentioned, I am in the technology space, included that in my opening comments. But what I didn't mention is I am a former teacher. I taught college for 7 years. And because I'm in the technology space, because I'm a teacher, the combination of those two, I definitely have, I want to make sure that this does not limit the use of technology in the classroom, because it is imperative and it is part of ensuring that the next generation is the most equipped as they enter into the global competitive workforce once they graduate with their academic career. And then I appreciate the comments from Representative Mariani in that one of the things that I have been trying to do and am grateful for, that this topic is not partisan. And I won't read the list, but I have multiple members from both parties that are co-authors on this bill. So this is an important topic, regardless of what your political persuasion might be. And then with that, Madam Chair, I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Representative Lucero. With that, the chair renews her motion that 1507 as amended be re-referred to the Committee on Education Finance. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails, and the bill is on its way to Education Finance. Thank you very much, Representative Lucero, and everyone who was hanging out with us tonight. We appreciate your diligence in following education policy. The meeting is adjourned.